Hello and welcome to this episode for we're talking about here the years in gaming, and this is Christmas week starting. So hope everyone has been having an amazing time during this stretch of the year. Although I know it can be kind of hectic and a little stressful, or a lot of stress for a lot of people. But either way, I just hope you find some peace and happiness during this time of the year, and hopefully at least get some time to take a break a bit or hang out with friends and family and maybe have a few alcoholic beverages or whatever it is that ultimately brings you any kind of joy during this time. um, I do apologize for the bit of a lack of quality on this segment here. As been There's a lot that I've been wanting to talk about in these podcasts, and so usually what I have to do, just because of the way my schedule works out and all, is I have to break it up some, where I record a part of it and then eventually I'll record another part at a later time and so forth. But this time here, I was recording this, or as I started recording this, I realized I don't have my little microphones that I usually have. So I'm just kind of talking, without no microphone here. But so I'm just going to do a small segment here of this. So hopefully the audio quality isn't too bad. But wanted to start up though here for the roulette of gaming. And let's see what this 3 games are selected, or which 3 games are selected here in this little segment here. So we're kicking it off here with these 3 random games. So starting off with number 1, and so I won't have my little usual sound effect that I do here. But number 1 is 1204. Let's see. And so that brings Sonic Adventure. Okay. Alrighty, and so let's pick the next one. 1044. And that is Rastan, or Roston. I don't know how you pronounce that. Roston? I think Roston sounds about right. We'll go with that. Okay, and next up, 1213. 1213. And that is Sonic R. All right, so we got a bit of a Sonic filled segment here. Okay, that's cool. Always, can appreciate the blue blur. All right, so let's talk about a bit about these games. So Sonic Adventure. Excuse me. So Sonic Adventure was released back in Japan, it was released in 1998. I think pretty early, or I'm sorry, kind of late in 1998. I want to say, I could be wrong, but I think it might have been was it a launch title in the Japan Streamcast launch? Not 100% sure, but if not, it would have been right around the corner, right? Or within its launch window. Again, that's for the Japan Dreamcast launch. And then eventually came over here to North America in September, what was it? September 9th, 1999, right? Because that was a big deal back then, how they were marketed at 99.99. And yeah, so Sonic Adventure was a launch title for the Sega Dreamcast here. Europe, I'm not quite sure when the Dreamcast came out over there in that area. But I do recall when this game, I remember seeing the screenshots of this when it first was launched over there in Japan in late 1998. So we were getting games like Metal Gear Solid, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Xenogears, Parasite Eve, and then earlier in the year we had great games like Resident Evil 2, Panzer Dragoon Saga, Shining Force 3, Banjo-Kazooie, so a wealth of awesome games, right? And so 1998 was an amazing year for the 5th generation of gaming. I recently did the previous year I talked about 1998, and so talked about all the great stuff that came out during that year. And so then towards the end of the year, though, it was in Game Fan magazine where I was seeing screenshots of Sonic Adventure. And so I was thinking, if things already was this good in the 5th generation, and again, I didn't know it as a 5th generation back then, but just within the Sega Saturn, PlayStation, and Nintendo 64, and this is what the future looks like, I was just so amazed by what the future could bring, right, for video games, as the graphics just looked absolutely amazing on it. And also, we hadn't really had a major Sonic game throughout the Saturn's lifetime. And so this was kind of a big deal, as I felt that it was going to be Sonic's and Sega's big revival, because up to this point, even though I felt that Saturn had a pretty good year in 1998, it's, no denying, right, that the system was on its way out in North America, at least. In Japan it did better, but in North America the Saturn was just pretty much dead. And so this, I felt, I was like, oh wow, this is gonna be like the Sega Super Mario 64 moment. And so ultimately, when the game came out here in North America, and it was one of the first games that I bought for the Dreamcast, because we got the Dreamcast not right at launch, but within like a few weeks afterwards, I believe. And so we got the game, and yeah, I mean, immediately I was pretty amazed by how just the overall graphic fidelity of it and all was just really impressive. Because when we made the jump to from fifth to sixth generation, it's one of the biggest jumps in video game as far as like technology wise and graphics and all that. And so it was pretty impressive to see. And the game itself was pretty fun. I had a lot of fun with it, and honestly, even to this day, it's still probably my favorite 3D Sonic game. Excuse me. I'm just I like the 2D Sonic games. I don't know, there's some of the 3D ones. There's been some that I've had some fun with, but nothing that I've really enjoyed immensely. But I do got to say that this has probably been my favorite one. It's been the only one, actually, that I've beaten all the way through. And a lot of it just had to do because I was just so floored by the graphics back then. It's funny because, sometimes when a certain generation comes out, and I mean, not so much anymore, but back then it was just always like you would play some of these games that, like launch titles and all, because you were just so amazed by the new technology, the new graphics and all. And eventually, in hindsight, when you go back, you're like, the game was all right, but it's just at that time. But even then, I feel like this game holds up okay. I mean, Sonic in 3D, running fast and everything, it's the controls are kind of all over the place at times, and the camera isn't always the best, and sometimes there's like glitches where Sonic is going so fast that he just kind of glitches through the walls and all. But it's still, I mean, me personally, I prefer this one much over Sonic Adventure 2. That game I had a lot of issues with, but this one here, I felt it was still pretty enjoyable though, and I've always had a good time every time I play it. Sometimes I just like replaying that beach level, and just going through it as you're going through the beach, and then eventually where all those killer whales are jumping out, and it's just very visually pleasing, very fun to play. Emphasizes a lot on Sonic speed, and just kind of a blast to play through. But yeah, I mean, it was the Sega Dreamcast, and I will talk about this later as I'm going into the the podcast years. I'm talking about 1999. So actually, this is perfect timing that this game was selected. We'll talk more about the impact overall of it there, but I would say that Sonic Adventure, while maybe not as grand as, say, like something like Super Mario 64 was to the Nintendo 64, it was still an important game for the Sega Dreamcast launch that was part of one of the games that was, for me personally, though, the overall best launch lineup of games in any console's history. Um, I'll get more into that as I'm going into later here. But Sonic Adventure, though, was a really fun time to play through, and still probably the Sonic Adventure game that I would probably want to, or the Sonic 3D game that I would want to experience again, instead of like trying to go through one of the new ones. Although I have been kind of playing a little bit of Sonic Generations, and I do enjoy that one there. That one seems pretty fun. But yeah, Sonic Adventure, cool game. But next one that was on the list was Rastan. I'm going to call it Rastan. Rastan, that doesn't sound right. If someone knows how to pronounce it correctly, let me know. But Rastan, this was a favorite of mine in the arcades. I used to love seeing and playing this game in the arcades, even though it is incredibly hard, though. But it's as a kid, I was a big fan of Arnold Schwarzenegger, a lot of fantasy movies, barbarian movies, or like Conan, Beastmaster, things like that. So this game was right up my alley, right? And when it came out in the arcades, I think it would have been 1987, I believe. I could give or take, right? And it was made by Taito, and it's a side-scrolling action game. You control this Rastan, who's very much like a Conan. The game is very inspired by Conan, and so you start off in the first stage where you're kind of like in these canyons, and just, swiping away with your sword on just a variety of like creatures, like these green monster looking things, and then you fight these what look like minotaurs and gargoyles and things like that. And there are some weapon power-ups and all. So the basic structure of the game is, so you have your main action segment where you're in some kind of a, for the most part, in an outside area of some sort. Like there's a canyon area, and then I believe there's like a swamp area, and I forgot some of the other stages. But the levels are sort of like split up into two, where there's a outside section, and then you go into like a kind of like a castle of some sort, and then inside the castle the gameplay changes up a little bit, where now you got to deal with booby traps and swinging across ropes to over like fire pits, and there's like spikes and all kinds of stuff, and then you fight some kind of a boss. Very challenging game though. It's very hard, and I remember I could never really get too far into it, but I just really enjoyed just the overall setting of the game and the music to it too. Also, which it kind of reuses the song quite a bit, but the main song of, at least I think it plays throughout a lot of the levels, but like at least in the first stage, it is so inspiring and like makes you feel like you want to go into battle. Still one of my favorite songs in a video game of all time, and it's great. It's such a joy to listen to it. I remember I used to like playing the game just to listen to that song, even though I would get killed right away. And I've tried playing it again now on. There's a version you can get through the arcade archives, like on the Switch, and it's it's challenging still. I mean, you can put it on there right now. We just get pretty much unlimited continues, but I need to try to actually sit down and try to beat the game here one of these days, because I got a little ways into it, but not all the way through. And it's a lot of fun to play through, but yeah, definitely very hard. But I think if you like that sort of setting, I think you can find a lot to appreciate with this game here with Rostan. And for the third pick, so I have Sonic R. So Sonic R was, I guess you can say, the Sonic game we got for the Saturn, like the original Sonic game. Let's see. So on the Sega Saturn, so there was Sonic 3D Blast, which is just really like a little bit of a spruced up Sega Genesis game, which has like an isometric view, and it's all right. Sonic 3D Blast isn't horrible, but it's not, again, it's very much a 16-bit game, with just slightly better graphics, and also not really like a traditional Sonic game. We had Sonic Jam, which was just a compilation of like the Sega Genesis 2D games, along with like a 3D hub world, which was pretty cool to explore, but it was just a hub world. But then we had Sonic R. And with Sonic R, it almost seems like this is sort of like Sega's answer to Mario Kart 64. And so it's a racing game, only, with characters like Sonic and Tails and Knuckles. You don't really need like a cart, because they're super fast as it is. But then you get like characters like Amy Rose, which she drives something, I believe a car of some sort, I think. And then Dr. Robotnik, which he's on some kind of like a hovering craft of some sort, I believe. But I believe, yeah, you have some weapons in it. It's been a while since I played this game, but I think you have some weapons on it, and you're just going through courses right and all too. Obviously come out at number one. And there's a few different like branching paths or hidden paths that you can unlock, and because throughout the courses you're collecting rings that I believe, if I remember right, it unlocks like a certain path that allows you to progress further in it. And I didn't play it back when it was out on the Saturn. It was one of the few games of like the main popular games that we didn't get on the Saturn, because back then, my brother actually, he bought pretty much a lot of like the big Saturn games. I mean, we had a decent collection of Saturn games back then, and this is one though that we never did get. I think it came out in, I want to say 1997. And so afterwards, I've played it through emulation, and it's it's a bit rough. The graphics are actually pretty nice in it for this, for a Saturn game. There's actually a lot of cool effects and all, like transparencies and all. It was developed by, I think, Traveler's Tale, I think. But it's a fun game in concept. It's just that the main issue that with the game is that the controls are very like the characters feel a bit uncontrollable because they steer a lot, like they oversteer a lot, and it's hard to keep them on the track. And then before you know, you're off track and all, and then you're trying to get back on, and so it's almost like you have to stay in this rhythm, almost like perfectly. Otherwise, one little oversteer and it feels like you completely lose control of your character. And I don't know. At first, it wasn't. I remember the first times that I played, I was like, "This is not very fun. The controls in this are horrible," and so I kind of kept putting off the game. But every now and then, I try to go back to it and all and play it. And I do remember I read this or heard this in a video somewhere where someone suggested that to play as Knuckles at first because he's a bit more, the handling on him is a bit better. And yeah, a little bit, yeah. But I still feel like the controls just aren't quite, they're not, I mean, you can kind of get used to them, but the game is still difficult to control. So it doesn't leave like a very good first impression. So just if you're going into this game, if you're exploring the Saturn library and you see, oh, Sonic R, right? Just kind of go into it knowing that, right? That it is a bit of a difficult game to control, but it does seem to have its fans though. So, you might have the patience to put up with it. I have kind of struggled to put up with this game. So I can't really, I mean, if you're a hardcore Sonic fan and all, or just want to check out the Saturn library, absolutely check it out, right? But if you're really wanting to experience something on the level of like a Mario Kart game, I mean, maybe you'll really enjoy it, but I'm gonna get a feeling that you might be a bit disappointed also. So just kind of go into it knowing that it's a very divisive game. I'll say that. But it has a soundtrack though that is just very joyful. It's a vocal, the soundtrack, it has vocal tracks on it, and it's I mean, think along the lines of like the Sonic Boom song, along the lines of that, and you'll kind of get an idea of what kind of music it's in this game. It's again, this is another thing that seems to be divisive amongst people, and I actually kind of like the soundtrack. It's cheesy as hell, but it definitely fits the tone of the game. So, for what it's worth, it's actually probably one of my more favorite things of this game for what it is. But yeah, Sonic Adventure, I'm sorry, Sonic R, it's, it's the original Sonic game that we got on the Saturn, and it is what it is, but in its own way, it does have its appeal though to it. But let's get now into the more modern gaming stuff, and hopefully this audio quality now is starting to sound better, as now I actually have an actual microphone for this segment here. But so we have a few things that were coming out as far as news for modern gaming this past week. And so starting off, I wanted to touch on my experience with the Final Fantasy VII Remake demo that came out specifically for the Switch 2, as I feel like a lot of people have been really wanting Final Fantasy VII Remake on the Switch 2, more so than say on the Xbox, because it did come out on there as well too, and it does have a demo on the Xbox as well. But I think a lot of it just has to do is because, well, the Switch 2 has more popularity, and also because of the hybrid nature of it. I gotta say that with the hybrid nature of like the Switch 2, it's really transformed the way people play games a lot, and I could say that for myself a lot, just because it really makes a difference as far as how much time you're able to even game because of it being portably. A lot of times when you're just busy and don't get a whole lot of time to just sort of be able just to play games as normal, being able to play it portably, right, does give you like these pockets of time though, and all still where you can still make get some gaming time in. And also, even if like there's times where I have time to say like just sit in front of the TV and play, sometimes that still feels like a bit of a commitment. And so just being able to play it portably, just for some reason, it still helps me be engaged more in it. It's I don't know, it's kind of weird. I think it's just one of those things where you just learn to appreciate it, that eventually it becomes your preferred way of playing games sometimes, even though I mean, generally I would rather play something on a big screen TV and all that, especially if it's like a more modern game, just because I like to see, all the fancy graphics and all that blown up on a big screen. But so I think that's a big part of the reason why a lot of people have been anticipating this one on the Switch too. And I can only offer my experience from what I can see, right, with my naked eye. And what what I can say is, I mean, it's definitely, first thing, just to get it out of the way, it's not at 60 frames per second, and it's not even at 40 frames per second. So you're locked into a 30 frames per second frame rate. And so, I mean, it's going to be roughly like what we were playing on the PlayStation 4. The It does have some of the enhanced lighting and I do believe shadow effects and all from the integrate version from the PlayStation 5, but it is again at only 30 frames per second. I'm sure there's like little details here and there, right? Between, like, let's say if you're comparing the PS4 Pro version over the Switch 2 version, that one might do better than the other. That's just what I can sort of see from my naked eye and all, right? You're basically getting the PS4 Pro version more or less, with just, maybe a few enhancements here, maybe some things that aren't quite as good, but more or less the same experience. But yeah, let's see. So for the Final Fantasy VII remake on the Switch 2, that's my personal opinion on it anyways. I first played the game on the PS4 Pro and then eventually on the PlayStation 5. So I've had that range to look at. And like I said, I mean, I feel like, I mean, if you're someone that doesn't really care too much about like frame rates and things like that and all, it's a perfectly fine version to play. Um, I mean, it looks good, especially like on the handheld, and I mean, because it is a fast action paced game, the 60 frames per second is definitely appreciated, right? And I mean, ever since now that I have a way to play that game in that mode there, that's generally going to still be my preferred way to play. And it is a bit tough to go back to like 30 frames per second, but I can't deny that the allure of just playing it portably, because that right there is what's a huge deal for me personally, where I may still purchase a game on the Switch too. And I mean, I will say this: I personally would be, if as long as the whole game runs like the way it does on the demo, because again, it's just a demo, right? Which I believe goes up to like the when you fight that boss at the end of the bombing run mission. Then I would say that's a perfectly fine port, right? The concern though is if you were to want to stick with the trilogy on the Switch too, is how are the next two games going to run? Because Final Fantasy VII Rebirth, that was made more specifically for the PlayStation 5. And even then, that game had a bit of struggles. So I'm kind of thinking that the game's going to struggle on the Switch too. I don't know how they can pull that off, and let alone whatever Part 3 is. Because, I mean, Part 3, we haven't seen anything about it yet. But for anybody that has played the original Final Fantasy VII and knowing what's still left to cover, there's a lot of huge, grandeur, spectacular moments, I'll say. And I mean, I'm kind of interested to see how, like, let's say the PlayStation 5 Pro handles that, let alone the Switch too, right? So that is just my original, or my quick impressions of it. Final Fantasy VII Remake on the Switch too. I feel it's worth it if you're willing to sacrifice like frame rate, but it is a smooth 30 frames per second. I'll say that. I mean, I was like, okay, I mean, that's about as smooth as 30 frames per second can look like. And again, I'm just talking about like with my naked eye and all that. Obviously, if you want to know more into the nitty gritty of it, definitely check out videos online about it. But that's just what I'm just glancing at really quick, right? And like I said, that one is a fine playable version, and I still might get it on there for that. But I guess I'm just more concerned if I wanted to stick with or get the trilogy on the Switch too, as far as like how it would perform. Ultimately, I'm still going to get it on the PlayStation 5, just because that's where I'm going to really want to play it. But we'll see how that all turns out. But still, I mean, I think it's pretty impressive, right? And all that the Switch 2 can do that in a handheld form. Because I'm playing it handheld, I'm like, wow, I'm playing something that looks visually this impressive on a handheld. Now I know, I guess we've been already able to do that, like let's say on the Steam Deck and all that, but just on something that's more, I guess on a more casual, more widely accepted, I guess you can say, form factor, is what I find really impressive about it. But I mean, it is kind of like it was back in the day, right? Where you get the more impressive version of a game on a home console, and then you get a bit of a scaled down version on the handheld. only now that scaled down isn't quite as big as it was back then. So, like you take a game like, oh, I don't know, I'm just kind of thinking here, like maybe a bad example, but like let's say the Mortal Kombat games, right? That came out on the Super Nintendo and on the Sega Genesis, and then you would get the Game Boy and the Game Gear versions of them. I mean, not quite as good for sure, right? But it's a version of the game you can play. Kind of the same thing, but again, that gap in like technological prowess is much, much smaller now than it was back then. And the fact, again, that you can play it on the go is just amazing. And now, like for Final Fantasy VII Rebirth and Remake, so again, I have those games on the PlayStation 5, and I have the PlayStation Portal, which I could play those games portably in a way, but because it's still tied to where I need an internet connection, right? That's where it's still limiting in a way, right? That you just don't really have that with the Switch too. So is what it is. But I'll probably still get it on there just because again I'm such a Final Fantasy VII is just it's amazing, right? Um, but yeah, I mean, and then as far as when the new one, Part 3 is going to get announced, I mean, nobody, there's a lot of speculation going on online as to why they didn't show it at the Game Awards. But I still feel like it was just a little too early because I still feel like they want to get the ones out on the PlayStation. I'm sorry, on the Xbox and then on the Switch too. Like they want to get those versions out, which is January, 22nd, and then I mean, more than likely, Final Fantasy VII Remake Part 3, whatever they choose to call it. Apparently, they have two names narrowed down, but they haven't. I don't know if I don't know if they actually know it because I think they said earlier that they knew the name, but now they're saying that they have two names pinned down. So I don't know what's going on with that. But basically, I mean, we might know the name sometime earlier, but I would say that we probably wouldn't get a trailer, in all honesty, until around roughly about when the game is about an year out. Now, what that year out is, I don't know, but again, I'm going to speculate still. I'm still shooting for that it's going to be in 2027, in the earlier part of 2027. So I'm going to say from like February to March, or I'm sorry, like April-ish or so, within that time frame right there. So then I'm going to say that we're going to get a trailer somewhere around spring to summer of 2026 is what's going to be my guess. Could be a state of play, could be maybe the summer award thing during the summer, but that's going to be my guess there because I feel like a lot of games have just been getting announced really early, ridiculously early in some cases. Metroid Prime 4, for example. And I know things happen behind the scenes and all, but I feel like that can. I mean, I guess it's kind of cool because there's an initial hype, but then that hype can kind of die down and this is the third one in the installment. So I want to say that they really want to emphasize on that a lot, that they want to get some good sales on this. And now the good thing is that now it's going multi-platform and all. And I mean, as far as like if it's going to be launching all at the same time on the Xbox and on the Switch 2 as a PlayStation 1, I don't know. I don't think so because the remake just came out. They would have to pump out the Rebirth here, like let's say by the end of next year or sometime soon, and then and then that way if they were to all launch simultaneously. So that's why I don't think they're going to launch all at the same time. And so and that's the other thing too, because I think they want the series to kind of breathe a little bit on the Switch 2 and on the Xbox before they really start making a big push for the third one, right? I don't know. That's just my speculation on. I don't know. That's just kind of what I'm thinking on, but we'll see. We'll see how it all turns out. But I'm still going to guess that it's going to be around the springtime or so of 2027 when the game gets released, and so when it'll start getting announced, will be about a year prior to that. So that's just kind of what I'm thinking on that. But we'll see. Um, we had Soul Calibur 3 come out on the PlayStation Plus. So this was announced a few months ago that it was coming out on there along with Tekken 3. Tekken 3 has come out and that plays great there on the PlayStation 3. Oh, I'm sorry, the PlayStation 5 or 4 or no, I think the PlayStation just 5 if you get like the higher premiere thing on the subscription thing there, which I know kind of sucks, but I think you can buy Soul Calibur 3, I think. And so I'm curious to check this one out because I haven't played it yet because Soul Calibur 3 is one of the more harder games to emulate. Uh, My PlayStation 2 nowadays, I usually play it like on my Odin 2 device or on my Xbox Series S, where I have emulation set up on there. But the Soul Calibur 3, there's one specific stage too also where there's like a fountain in the background and all where it really kind of chugs. And so isn't able to really keep up with it. I know that there's ways you can tweak the emulators, and also I haven't really gone too far into that to really see if I can make it work better. But that's just been my experience with it with the normal default settings that I use. That normally seems to work pretty well with most PlayStation 2 games. So I'm kind of curious to see how this version handles it on the PlayStation, let's say the PlayStation 5. But yeah, that's pretty cool that this game came out on there. And this is probably one that came out because Sony had a bit of an exclusive deal on this one for some reason when it came out. And I want to say this would have been in 2005 or 2006 because Soul Calibur came out on the Dreamcast. Soul Calibur 2 came out on the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and GameCube. But then Soul Calibur 3, for some reason, only came out on the PlayStation 2, kind of late in its lifetime. And then Soul Calibur 4, and then Soul Calibur 5 ended up being multi-platform. And so, yeah, I guess I'm not sure what happened with Soul Calibur 3, that it was just exclusive to the PlayStation 2, but I'm thinking maybe that's why they got this version here. And it's a fine Soul Calibur game from what I remember playing of it, so I'll be curious to jump in there and get it, or download it. But Hollow Knight Silksong also announced a DLC that'll be coming out in 2026. It'll be free, and yeah, so that's all good news. So it's called the Sea of Sorrow. Don't know a whole lot much about it other than, again, it's free. And yeah, cool. Thanks to Team Cherry for doing that. And they're still continuing to support this game a lot like they did with the Hollow Knight game. And so that's just awesome, right? I mean, it's definitely these small independent studios will, you know, they've definitely been keeping they've definitely been showing, right, how the industry should be ran. And so kudos to them for that. So for Team Cherry and for, what is it, Sandfall Interactive, I think they're called, the dudes behind um, Clair Obscure. So that's awesome. Looking forward to that. And I feel like I need to really, I feel like, okay, I got a little bit of time since I beat Hollow Knight. I think now is maybe a good time to really start getting into Silksong, because I feel like that game, it's, from what I heard, it's because right now I'm about 2 hours into it and it's been fine. It's been great, and I'm liking it so far. And I just haven't, like I said, I've just been playing it in spurts here and there, so I haven't really gotten into it. And the difficulty on it hasn't been too bad. I'm like, okay, this is actually not really bad. It's actually fairly easy. Man, I'm thinking, well, maybe I've just gotten so used to Hollow Knight. But I do hear that like a little bit later where it gets ridiculously hard for a lot of people. So I'm going into it knowing that, right? So, but yeah, maybe that'll I'll really start trying to pull time into that. My gaming schedule right now is like all out of whack right now because as I'm trying to do some of these retrospectives and everything, sometimes I get caught up in some older games, and where I end up getting sidetracked on some of the newer stuff that I want to play. And then also sometimes my time just gets in my work schedule and life schedule and all that gets kind of all out of whack. And so I end up just kind of like dropping games here and there and all. And so it's all over the place. I'm trying to pin down more of a realistic gaming schedule and all, where I can play some games that I really want to play and dedicate more time to just like play like one game and all, but still being able to do some of this retrospective stuff that I'm trying to do with this podcast thing. So try to balance all that out, but we'll see how this goes. But yeah, Hollow Knight Silksong is definitely calling my name. So I'm like, I kind of want to go back and play that. So I just love the first one so much, and I kind of feel like a little bit up for a challenge too. um, Another news that came out, this is sort of a PSA, but there was a lot of people mentioning about PlayStation 5s that are failing. So I remember this got reported on like maybe 2 years ago or so, where on the PlayStation 5, so there it uses like this liquid metal and some of it's, I don't know. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to be the most techie guy when it comes to this stuff. So just, excuse my kind of um, limited knowledge on this, but there's some kind of a component on there that uses like liquid metal. And so I remember it was like about 2 years ago or so where the main concern was like if you have the system upright, so vertically, that this liquid metal can start leaking and seeps into some of the circuit boards and all, or something to that effect, causing your PlayStation 5 to fail. So that was coming out for a bit from some people that were talking about it, but then a lot of people kind of came out supposedly debunking it. But the story's coming out again here, and so from something that I read on an article, it says something like about that the all PS5 consoles, so this is including like the regular PS5, and I'm assuming the PlayStation 5 Pro also, will eventually require maintenance. PlayStation 5 liquid metal degradation can reportedly impact all systems. So yeah, so again, kind of it looks like there are reports of it coming back still that the liquid metal in it is leaking and again causing some issues for some PlayStation 5s. So just something to be aware of, right? And I mean, how do you play your PlayStation 5? Do you have it up vertically or horizontally? I think I did see another quote somewhere, and I didn't write it in here, but I think I read something that it really doesn't matter now that if it's horizontally or vertically. I don't know. I mean, I would think vertically because it's gravity. It seeps downwards. But again, that's just my very limited knowledge on my understanding of how that all works. So definitely, if it is a concern, right, as far as like like if you have your PlayStation, like if you use your PlayStation 5 a lot and you have it vertically or I guess even horizontally, I guess start maybe look into it and all to see if it's something that maybe you should be concerned about, right? And all and like I mean I use my PlayStation 5 fairly frequently. I mean, it's turned on quite a bit, but a lot of it is just because that's one of the more main systems that we use, like when we're watching Netflix or YouTube and things like that. And then also my daughters love playing Astrobot on there, so they play it quite a bit. Actually, they play it more than my PlayStation 5 more than I do nowadays. But that's so far I haven't had any issues with it. I mean, I never had issues with my PlayStation 5, and I had that for I did get the PlayStation 5 Pro last year, but other than that, I got the PlayStation 5 fairly early. I wasn't able to get it at launch, but I was lucky enough to get it like around January of 2021, right? When there was it was hard to get that system. And it's been working, and it worked fine for me. I never had any issues with it. Once I upgraded to the PlayStation 5 Pro, I gave the base PS5 to my brother, and I don't know how much he uses it on his end, but as far as I know, it's still working. So but so again, it's maybe not something that affects all systems, but it seems like there's enough reports out there that maybe look into the story and see if it's something that at least so that you're educated on it. Um, but another thing too, and I don't like speculating too much on rumors and such. I mean, they're fun to look into and all. I just always kind of take it like just that, right? That it's just fun to speculate, but never try to take it as gospel, right? And all like if something's really gonna happen. So I don't try to touch base on that too much, unless I'm just really doing it for the purpose of just specifically entertainment and just to have discussions around it and all, but not something that like, hey, I really feel this is happening. But there's been more and more rumors coming out that so next year is going to be Zelda's 40th remake or 40th anniversary, 40th remake, 40th anniversary. And so there's already a lot of speculation onto what might be happening. And so when I say 40th anniversary, so The Legend of Zelda that came out in 1986 in Japan. Um, and so one of the things that keeps getting brought up a lot, it's been going on for years now, but has been of a remake of The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time. And I heard something that like they were trying to split it up like into three parts also. And so I saw the headline on that. I'm like, what? Like, what are they trying to do like a Final Fantasy VII remake trilogy? Because that'd be kind of awkward. But I think I saw in the comments, so that somebody said something along the lines of like it was more like there was going to be like Ocarina of Time, and then that might get split up a little bit, but then also including like Majora's Mask, all like in some kind of a bundle of some sort. Again, I don't know the full specifics on that, but I just keep seeing a lot, and I haven't dove too much into the story, but I just kept seeing a lot of like videos being made on a possible remake again, right, for Zelda's 40th anniversary, and so. I mean, again, it's fun to speculate and all, but who knows if any of this will happen. But I do feel like a remake of Ocarina of Time does sound pretty realistic, though. It's a highly regarded game, the highest rated game of all time, according to Metacritic. And again, that comes with a bit of an asterisk, right? And I'll just, I think I've talked about it before that it's, not as many reviews as they are now. And, it was just a different time for how we were viewing that game back then. And that's compared to like how something like that would impact us now. And, a lot of different things, right? And again, I don't say that no shade against the game. The game is still absolutely amazing to me. Ocarina of Time is my 10th favorite game of all time. But so it was a highly influential game, but it's definitely aged some. And there's certain elements about it that it's a bit, it can be a bit difficult to really get back into, like if you're playing the old school version, right? And I mean, it's still a highly playable game. The core of what makes that game special is still there, absolutely, right? I'm just saying, like, because I try to talk in a perspective of like I can go back to old games and absolutely appreciate them, right? I can still take myself back in that time and say, yes, this is still awesome. One big example of a lot of games like that is like the stuff that came out in the fifth generation, because I think that there's a bit of a new appreciation for those games because I keep seeing, and I'm starting to use it sometimes too, also the term low poly aesthetics. And what's crazy is that I think I've even seen like sixth generation style games called as low poly. I'm like, Jesus Christ, we've gone into a whole different era now, but basically like that aesthetic there, and it seems to be there's a newfound appreciation for them. But for a long time the ongoing sentiment was that games from that generation just didn't really age well, as far as the graphics goes, as far as like camera control, as far as like UI things and settings and things like that. So for example, like Ocarina of Time, it's the one of the things that bugs me about that game a lot, that it makes it, not that I can't go back and play it and appreciate it, I still love that version, but it's the dialogue, right? Like the text, and then sometimes it's like it's just so slow, and it does bug me. I'd be lying if I said it didn't. And uh, and so that's, again, so kind of a big hindrance on that original version there that they really fixed with the 3D, Ocarina of Time 3D on the 3DS, where that's just a much funner version of play because I'm playing that game, and I mean it's more or less the same game, right? It's just that how quickly the dialogue speeds up. It's just crazy how like something so simple can make something seem just so much more playable. But that's for me personally, that's a better way to play that game because of that. It's just that it's stuck on the 3DS. Not a bad thing necessarily, right? And all, like I said, like I've mentioned before, I'm starting to appreciate and even like playing games more handheld, but I still kind of want it like on a big screen also, right? And there's also kind of in the modding scene, if you're into this. So I just recently found out about this, maybe like a few months ago. I don't, did I talk about this in a previous podcast? I don't remember, but so I found out about a way how you can play The Legend of Zelda through what's called the Ship of Harkanian, I think is what it's called. If you don't know about this, and if you're willing to do a little bit of modding on a game, how you acquire your ROM is, up to you. But I messed around with it. It was a few months ago, and so I play it on my own and two now. But basically, you can, if you have like the ROM of The Legend of Zelda, and then you add these mods to it, you can play the game in widescreen, 60 frames per second, have the textures and all more or less from like kind of like what they look like on the 3DS version. And there's a lot of quality of life improvements on it too also. So for example, the text, right? You can you can adjust it so that you don't have to go through all these old, like really slow moving text. And it looks gorgeous. It's becoming my more preferred way of playing that game now. There's a lot of different settings you can tweak on it too also for like a lot of quality of life improvements, like everything from adjusting certain things on mini games and a lot of different things. I haven't messed around with a lot of the options, but those are like the main standout, right? 60 frames per second, widescreen support, more or less the 3DS textures. Some of them don't look quite as good or as detailed, but some of them look really nice. And it looks really, the resolution is really sharp on it too, also. And so I play it like on my Odin too, and it runs wonderfully. So it played like, so basically, this is a version you can play on not only on your PC, but also like on an Android system. Maybe on the Steam Deck too. I'm not quite sure. But it's not super hard to get set up. So again, if there's plenty of tutorials out there if you wanted to explore that. So Ship of Harkanian, something like that. If you start kind of Googling that, I'm sure you'll find something if you want to go down that rabbit hole. But it's definitely fun to play. My only little issue with it is that as I've been playing it and I've gone up to the point where after you meet Zelda and then can go up this mountain, but usually the way I've always played this game is that after that section right there, I'm trying to do a lot of like collecting a bunch of items everywhere as much as I can up to that point. So that's where I'm at right there. So I'm not too far into it, but I have been already encountering like a lot of glitches. Well, not a lot, but some. Like for example, there's in the section where you're going to one of the graveyards and there's like these kind of like light beams that shoot down. Sometimes they're kind of glitchy on the light beams the way they show, and then also if there's like a hole on the ground, like the texture on it, it looks nice and all. It's just that it kind of rotates along with you, and so it doesn't seem like natural, right? Like it's just kind of placed there. I don't know. It's kind of weird to describe, but so it has some glitches, and maybe there's ways to fix it with some of the settings that are on there, right? That I haven't messed around with too much, but just again, it doesn't seem like it's a perfect way to play it, but it's a nice way to play it, right? So just FYI. But anyways, long story short, uh, no, short story long, I guess that's what I really meant to say. With these rumors coming out of The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, I think that this is something that Nintendo would want to do because it is such an important game to them, and it makes sense, right? I mean, it's because from Nintendo themselves, yes, they did release that 3DS version, but that was even if you're counting that one, that was back in 2011, and that was on I mean, the 3DS sold fairly well, but but they haven't really re-released that game in a way where it's like, in a more grandiose way. And I mean, this is like their top, game as far as like critical relevance, right? And so that's why I feel like it seems to make sense, right, that they're gonna do this. Now, I don't have any insider information and all like of this. It's just a feeling that I get, right, and all, and then just kind of going off of a lot of rumors that are out there. But it seems to make sense. And I personally would love to see this because I've been dying to see a game from The Legend of Zelda that is in a more kind of not hyper realistic, but a more realistic graphics than say like what we've been getting with like Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I want to see something along the lines of like Ocarina of Time or Twilight Princess, but just like with more today's graphics. So what like say what the Switch 2 could do. And so that's what I would really be interested in seeing. And I say that because there's somebody or a group of people that have been doing like a modded version, or like they're messing around with doing a remake of Ocarina of Time, but running on the Unreal 5 engine. They're just kind of like piecing together segments of a game and all. And I think there's even a playable version out there. And, I've just seen YouTube videos on it and it looks absolutely amazing. And so I can only imagine, right, and all what a game like that would look like a full game and all. And so kudos to whoever the dude is, name is Cyril or something like that. I don't know. But, it just, if we could see like an actual full blown remake like that and all along the lines of that, I would be all there for it. I like the art style of Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. I think it's a great art style, especially when you see it like on the Switch 2 versions. But I just really kind of want more like a more realistic looking version, and that's why I've been, I would be really hyped if that's something that does exist. So hopefully it does. We'll know more, on the 40th anniversary. Um, again, but this game has been long rumored for a long time. So, again, it's all just speculation and all, but, one can dream, right? So it's funny because I paused it a little bit earlier. Usually on Sundays, I'll get Starbucks here for breakfast. And So just something to kind of try to pep me up as I record these pretty early in the morning on usually, I mean, I've been trying to spread them out a little bit. Like if you heard of my first segment about when I was doing the roulette of gaming, I recorded that a few days ago, and it but then usually when I try to do the main bulk of my recording is on a Sunday morning, and so I wake up kind of early to do it. So I'll get Starbucks and just to give myself my little matcha drink to try to waken me up a bit, and then also I'll get my girls like a little treat too also. And my daughter came in here a little while ago, and because I got her a brownie, right, so she can just something to kind of keep her occupied there. And but I got myself also like a bacon Gouda sandwich, and so I was in here eating it, and she comes in and just wanted to talk to me about, she had a bad nightmare, so talking her through that. But then she's like, "What are you eating, Daddy?" I was like, "Oh, it's a sandwich," which it's not something that I would think she would eat. She's like, "Can I have some?" And I just had like, I don't know, maybe like about the last quarter of the sandwich left. And I was like, "Sure, yeah, if you want to take a bite." I was like, "I don't think you'll like it." And she took a bite, kind of had a not much of an expression on it. And I was like, "Did you like it?" And she's like, "Yeah." And then she just walked out of the room with my sandwich. So I got to eat three-fourths of a bacon Gouda sandwich this morning. But that's good though. I'm glad that she's at least like something that has more substance to it, like instead of just like you know, something that she probably shouldn't be eating. But kids sometimes it's hard to get them to eat. I mean, some kids might be different and all, but trying to get them to eat protein and all is sometimes can be a bit of a challenge. But anyway, parental things there. Um, but let's see. So there's kind of two major stories that I can say that came out here, and both of these are still ongoing stories. So, and I jotted the notes down on this a few days ago. So right now we're on December 21st when I'm recording this part. So again, some of this information there might be it's not outdated, I would say. It's just that there's more that's come out on it probably by now. But starting with the first one, so Nintendo, there was some speculation that Nintendo was going to come out with more multiple game cards memory sizes. So if you don't know, right now with the Switch 2, there's a big old controversy with the system where most of the Nintendo games, from what it sounds like, are going to come on a game card and the full game is going to be on there. Most Nintendo games in general, they're not too large in sizes, so I think they can get away with that because the game card that they have right now it's 64 gigabytes, and which is, I mean, for Nintendo games, that seems about right. But the end, I mean, we're looking like I think I've seen like 200 gigabyte games out there, right? So they did a lot of games, more modern games wouldn't fit on that. Um, and so what's been happening is there's some games that they'll put on the 64 gigabyte cartridge, but then there's a lot of games out there where like if they're bigger in size, well, they couldn't fit on the cart anyways. So, like, if you take, like, let's say Final Fantasy VII, it's rumored to be about 93 gigabytes or so, or something like that. So that's just not going to fit on a game card, the biggest one that Nintendo has right now, which is 64 gigabytes. So that's going to have to be a digital game or a game key card. And again, there's a whole game card fiasco, right? So I'm sure if you're a gamer, you already know about this kind of stuff and all. But I would hope that anybody that would watch my stuff also is maybe for like people that like busy dads and everything, or busy parents that just don't really have time to like indulge in a lot of this video game news and all. But basically, if you don't know, game key cards, it's a physical card and it comes in a case and all that, but the card itself, it's just has a code on there. So you plug it into your Switch 2, or you insert into your Switch 2, and it gives you a code. I mean, it doesn't give you like a code, I guess, but it unlocks a digital version of the game. So meaning on the card itself, it just has minimal data just to unlock the game so that you can download it digitally. That's what it is, right? Um, so like Final Fantasy VII Remake, absolutely going to be a game key card, right? It just wouldn't fit on a regular card. So for bigger games, obviously, right, that's you're just gonna have to deal with that with game key cards if you're wanting a physical collection, which I know that's a big, huge controversy nowadays. But there's a lot of games though that are smaller in size, and think like retro inspired games or just more smaller independent games and all that they're kind of in a hard place where Because apparently the 64 gigabyte card that Nintendo offers is pretty expensive. Something like, I don't know, I think I heard something like it was like $20 to get that. And so, like, if you're a retro kind of game, and let's say you cost $40 to buy the game, well, you just paid $20 just to get the card, to put it on a card, right? And so, not the best profit margins there. And so there's been a lot of talk about why won't Nintendo release smaller memory cards? Because if they're, because again, the 64 card that they have, it's kind of expensive and it's just a lot of wasted space. Because like if your game is like, let's say 7 gigabytes, right? Well, there's a lot of wasted space there. And, so why would they pay that extra money to put it on a physical card when it's just, they're just not going to make a lot of profit for it, and their game is just smaller in size, so just might as well just put it digitally, right? Or on a game key card, for example. But if they were to release a 16 gigabyte card or a 32 gigabyte card, for example, well, those should be cheaper and makes more sense, right, for companies to do that, where they can put it on an actual physical card where the full game is on the card. But so it sounds like Nintendo, or so there was some speculation that Nintendo was going to come out with different size cards. So that was originally, because again, this is an ongoing story, so that's kind of like early part of last week what I was hearing about it. But just yesterday, I followed up on a story that, so I think it's R-Type Delta that's coming out with a remake, or it came out already, or something like that. And that seems interesting. I'm kind of curious to check that out at some point, maybe. But that game there, so they made an announcement of some sort. It's kind of funny actually, but they made an announcement of some sort that, yeah, we're gonna put our game on a game card, right, instead of a game key card, because now that supposedly Nintendo was coming out with these different size memory of game card. So that came out a few days ago. Well, the speculation though is that later, sometime soon after, Nintendo probably got wind of it and all, because then the company that's doing this R-Type Delta, they came out with a statement saying, hey, so there's something that was announced that, don't take it like an official update from Nintendo about the game card, and more or less kind of apologize for providing the information that it was going to be on a game card. So it kind of sounds like Nintendo said, like, hey, you're not supposed to announce that. That's something that we do internally, or however they decide to do it, where Nintendo's controlling the narrative and all. And so that's at least the impression everyone's gotten, right? Uh, Fucking Nintendo, man. Like, just like, I don't know. It's just, I get it. You're a business. You're trying to control your products and all that. But damn, man. You guys are just like trigger happy when it comes to lawsuits and all that. Just, it just doesn't seem like that big of a deal. But again, that's why they're a successful company. And that is why someone like me is just, well, just a lowly person here, not a successful business person. But it seems petty though, highly petty, but no, is what it is. But anyways, it was kind of funny, and hopefully they don't get busted too much for, I guess, for doing that, because Nintendo's really known to go after companies like that. But hopefully maybe it was just a slap on the wrist, like, hey, don't put that out there. That's for us to control. But yeah, but it does sound like that might be the case. But but then that leads into another discussion with everything going on nowadays, with game prices increasing and all that because of chip shortages and all that kind of stuff, right? And all, which again, I don't know the full extent of it and all. It's just the speculation is that there's going to be increase in video game prices across the board next year, just because of all the RAM shortages and all, and because of AI that's taking up a lot of them, and blah 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 blah, right? So how much of that will be a good thing? Who knows? Because yes, you might get physical game cards now, but they're going to maybe be kind of expensive. So like, just, and again, I don't know if this is a good comparison or not, and I might be wrong on this, but so the Terminator 2D No Fate that just came out, which is excellent. But the digital version of that costs $29.99. I believe the physical version costs $59.99. I could be wrong on that, but I think so. And so, and again, it's just because of production costs and all that, which is like, we're really trying to get out of this physical media stuff, because, I mean, Wasn't it usually used to be that if what you know, so when games started coming out digitally, so in the seventh generation, and you started seeing games digitally, it was, whatever the price was digitally was more or less the same price physically on retail, right? With no discounts included. But now we're getting to the point where if something is coming out digitally, but if you want to get the physical version, why you got to pay more for it now? It's like, I don't know. It is what it is, I guess. And I say this all, where I buy most of my games digitally for just things I've already explained, a lot before. But I do get it. And it is a concern, right? Just because, again, I love the convenience of digital, but I'm also, I understand too also that this stuff could just go away one day, right? Where if Nintendo decides to pull the plug on the eShop, let's say 10 years from now, and it's like shit, there goes all my games on my Switch and Switch 2. So hopefully by then there's ways to jailbreak the systems and all where I'll be able to play them. Like on the Wii U, for example, or the 3DS, the cool little hacks you can do on that. The what do they call the H shop or whatever it's called. I messed around with that a few months ago, and I'm like, okay, this is pretty cool. So, and I'll just leave it at that. I don't want to go too much into detail of how you can do that. Just first of all, because I'm not the most techie person to do like a tutorial on how to do that stuff, but and also just for don't want I, I'm a small little nobody, right, doing this here, and also I highly doubt anybody would be coming after me. But at the same time, I feel that it's something that if you don't put your stuff out in a convenient form factor, people will find a way to get it. And it's just it's a form of rebellion, I think, and all, and I agree with it. It's just um it's just greediness out there that's taking over, that people are going to be forced to just kind of go a different route, right, to obtain certain products, I guess I'll leave it at that. Just sometimes you got to put on your old Captain Jack Sparrow hat on. But yeah, well, I mean, we'll see what happens with all that there. But that kind of leads into the big story, though. Here, I feel, anyways, that came out this week, and that is that. So we talked about last week about the sales of these consoles, right? They happened during the Black Friday. So with the PlayStation 5 coming out on top, the Switch 2 at number two, and then the next Playground little cube thing that came out at number three. Maybe I might talk about that system some more at some point. I was playing it a little bit with my daughters last night, and it is fun. It's a cool little system, and well, I mean, there's certain things that I don't like too much about it, like the whole subscription thing to have access to the full library. But it's definitely a nifty little idea, and it's a good little product for the more casual market. So maybe I'll talk about it at some point. But basically, so I don't have the full specs on this, right? So if you want like the actual numbers and all, I'm sure you can find it online somewhere. But basically, the breakdown is that they did some figures, and so hardware and physical software sales are down a lot that they were down a lot in November of this year. So much so that hardware sales were down 27% from last year, and it's been the worst hardware and physical sales of video games, console, and software since November of 1995. That's quite the drastic drop. Um, so so there's a lot there, right? And so what's going on, right? And I mean, there's a lot going on, a lot. And I feel that one of the main reason I feel is, well, I mean, it's two of them. So what I do in my day job, well, let's just say that I am involved in a lot of people's finances and walking them through things and all, helping people with their finances and all. And all I can say is that within the past year, I mean, really within the past 5, 6 years or so, and especially this year, a lot of people are struggling out there. It's a lot of people are struggling from all walks of life. It is and I don't want to. This is the purpose of what I do here and all. It's really just for entertainment, for video game purposes and all. But because this does touch base on stuff that is happening in the real world, that also leads into video games and all. I'll touch base a little bit on this, right? And now I'm not someone that though is that can really provide like very detailed information on this. So again, this is just sort of speculation and just my own personal experience with it. But I mean, it is rough out there right now. What's happening with the economy and everything? It is really rough out there for a lot of people. It's I mean, I hear a lot of stories, and I mean, honestly, a lot of times it's I just as I go through my day by day and all, and it kind of wears on me a bit just hearing how many people are struggling out there. And I mean, so many sad stories that I've heard that it breaks my heart a lot of times. And I mean, people are truly struggling out there. And I'm talking about just like, just the everyday regular people, right? I mean, if you happen to be someone that happens to listen to this, dumb little podcast that I'm doing here, you're probably someone like me, someone like just a regular everyday person, right? And that, we're just trying to get by. We're just trying to get by, right? We're working, we're trying to do the best we can to survive on our own, feed our families, or stay afloat and all that. And it's just getting really difficult out there for people because of just how expensive everything is. Everything from food to cars to trying to get a house or maintaining a house and all that kind of stuff. So that's a huge factor, right? I mean, it's the reality of whatever your beliefs are or whatever, right? I feel like everyone can agree on that things are just very expensive nowadays. So that is going to be an absolute huge factor as to something that is causing this, right? As to like, and again, it seems like trivial to say, right? That, that, oh, I can't afford a video game. But again, that's what more my podcast is for, right? I'm not going to speculate like on a lot of other stuff. That's for other people to do and all. But basically, yeah. I mean, it comes down to is like, well, what am I going to buy? The Switch 2 or put food on my table? Well, I mean, if you're a reasonable, responsible person, you're going to put food on your table, and because it gets that way for a lot of people, it be that way for a lot of people that they're really having to choose to pay the necessities and don't really have time or money for just like any kind of form of like luxuries of some sort or like entertainment things and all that, because that becomes last resort if you can even afford any of that. And so it's highly unfortunate, right, that we're in this scenario, but it is what it is. So that's definitely a big reason why people are probably not buying video games now, any kind of entertainment, right? I mean, going to the movies is expensive as hell. I mean, the movie industry isn't doing so great either. I mean, you're going to have your big blockbuster movies, right? Like Zootopia seems to be doing really well. Although I think a lot of that is overseas sales, but I'm not sure. Avatar, we'll see how that does. But again, movies also, they seem to be taking a bit of a hit. It's just, I don't like to curse too much on this, because I would want like just a lot of age range, right? And I'll listen to this and all, but it is fucking difficult out there for a lot of people. I mean, like I said, the stories that I hear almost every day, right? With what I do in my day job, it's very heartbreaking. So that's a big reason there why. But another thing too also is that a lot of companies nowadays that so again, I'm just going to stick within the realm of video games here. They certainly don't make it easy also, because I still feel that if you have a good product out there, if you have a good product that is in demand and all, and that is fairly priced, that people will still find a way to buy it. And I mean, I'm just thinking of like, let's say COVID, right? COVID was a very difficult time in 2020. And the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X, I mean, we wouldn't know what they would become, but at the time they were hot commodities and they sold really well. Like the Steam Deck, right? Also, I mean, it's, I don't think it's putting up huge numbers, but I feel like within its realm of what its market is, that it sells pretty well also. And, and again, this is still during a stretch of, financial difficult times. And I know, I mean, a lot has changed within these past few years, right? And all, but I still feel like if you have a product that is in demand, that people will still find a way to buy it. Now, but these systems are also just crazy expensive because we are. I may have some of my numbers off here, but we're what 5 years, little over 5 years from when the PlayStation 5 came out. So using the PlayStation 5 as an example, and so the system came out at what $500, I believe. So there was some Black Friday sales, and from what I understand, the Black Friday sales were basically just bringing the system back down to its original launch price because the system has increased in price fairly recently. And again, I'm just using the PlayStation there as an example. So how do you figure? I mean, it's you go back any year, pretty much any generation, and when a system was like 5 years old or so, starting to get into the last little stretch there of its lifetime, the systems were starting to become discounted, right? But that's not the case here. The systems are going up. I mean, so much so that the sale, if there's a sale on it, you're going back to the base price. Um, the Switch 2, it's a Nintendo system, and I mean, I feel for what the Switch 2 is, and all that price at 450 is not too bad, but understandably, it's still a more expensive Nintendo system than what people are used to. That's why I think that the next Playground sold pretty well because it was that casual system that Nintendo usually has that market down, that people were like, "Ooh, that Switch 2, I don't know, 450, but here's a 250 next Playground thing that looks like some shit for the kids that'll keep them busy." um, and I think it was like at $200 on a Black Friday sale, I think is what I saw. So, I mean, they're expensive, right? And so that's one thing. And again, people will say that it's the economy nowadays as to why companies have to sell these systems at a higher price. But I don't know, and I don't know how much I buy that. I don't know for sure. It seems just very greedy, right? That they're just taking advantage of it. But at the same time, I mean, and again, I'm not defending any company or anything. But there are, if I were to try to just look at things realistically, with all the RAM shortages and all, then yes, that could very well be a reason why just maybe they do have to sell it at a higher price. I don't know. Right? I don't know enough about that kind of stuff. I'm just kind of speculating, right? But it's, I mean, basically they're still very expensive. And the other thing too also is I still feel though, like again, if you have a good product that people will buy it. Well, with the PlayStation 5, I mean, there was really like a PlayStation 5 exclusive, like a Sony exclusive that that we were used to for many generations now. There wasn't really anything this year. I mean, there was some good games this year, but I mean, you can play them anywhere really, like Claire Obscure, Hollow Knight Silk Song, the Kingdom Come Deliverance, whatever other game came out this year. I'm kind of losing track of it, but basically, you can play them pretty much everywhere. I can't think of a Sony exclusive that came out this year that was like, I need to get a PlayStation 5 for that game. There wasn't really anything. The Xbox, the Xbox was the Xbox. Um, the Switch 2. I mean, that one there, I mean, it was a new system from Nintendo, right? They had some exclusive Mario Kart World, Donkey Kong Bonanza, Metroid Prime 4. I mean, Metroid Prime 4 was also on the Switch, but, on the Switch too, also. And I mean, I think those games are they're good. They're not bad. They're actually really good. I really been enjoying Donkey Kong Bonanza actually. Um, excuse me, but I still feel that they're not. They didn't quite have that mega hit. Like maybe it takes the next Mario game or a Zelda game, right? And all to really say like, oh, okay, this is a really good, excuse me, Switch 2 exclusive. And also just everything that I've already talked about as far as like how the Switch 2 is pricing things with the game prices and all that. And so people are just finding other ways to play games, like PC, for example, I would assume, right? Or even just going back to retro stuff, that the allure of like getting the latest and greatest is just not there for a lot of people also, let alone with everything. Like I said, what I already talked about, what probably the main reason was, just people are just broke nowadays. Um, and so you take a combination of all that, and that's what these figures here aren't surprising, basically. And it's It's interesting, it's going into 2026, things look a little bleak actually, if you really start kind of looking into it, because there is a lot of good games coming out next year. I mean, a lot of big games, like, you got Resident Evil 9, Wolverine, and what else was coming out next year? I'm trying to minding the main big one that's coming out, but what else? I know there's some other games that were set to come out next year, but also Grand Theft Auto 6, right? But with all the RAM shortages that is going around because of all this AI thing that is, just advancing at a crazy accelerated rate, that is just taking over everything nowadays, and the power that it's needed to maintain it. Um, and then with, again, all the RAM shortages that they're talking about and all, and how that's going to spike up a lot of prices and all. I, you know, everybody's been talking about like this crash, right? That's going to happen again, and I think a lot of people like almost want it to happen, like, almost like an exciting thing that we had a monumental historic event in the video game history, right? And all, like we did back in 1983. Mm, I, you know, I something could happen for sure, I think, but the video game industry is very different now than what it was back then. And so back then, it was just a huge influx of games that came out, and there was just no the like the distribution procedures and all that they had back then just caused a lot of retail glut, and all that just caused everything just to like crash again. And so if anything happens this year, or I mean, not sorry, this year in this time, for the video game industry to crash, I think it would look a little bit different. But what I could see potentially, right? I don't know. I'm just kind of spitballing here. Is that because of the prices of RAM shortage, or increasing because of RAM shortages, that could potentially cause like a lot of systems to be left out there and nobody buying them and all, and so it could cause some form of a crash that way. Is my thought, right? I don't know, but the whole, like, say, like video game just die out completely, I don't think so, because I mean there's a lot of passionate fans out there that will still find ways to play games. Um, whether it be through independent titles, or whether it be through emulation, or along those lines, right? But like the AAA video game industry, yeah, there could be some sort of form of a crash. Again, but it would look very different, I feel, than what it was last time. I mean, there might be some parallels that might be the same, but um I don't know. It'll be interesting to see what happens next year. Because it's interesting, like, so I mean, because if the sales are down that much, well, what was, worse since 1995? Well, what was going on in 1995, right? And so again, different era, but in 1995, so in November 1995, so we had the fourth generation systems, like the Sega Genesis, the Super Nintendo. They were kind of dying out already. The Super Nintendo still held on a little bit because in 1996 it still had some big releases like Donkey Kong Country 3 and Super Mario RPG come to mind. But for the most part, though, it was on its way out also, and especially the Sega Genesis. There was the 3DO and the Atari Jaguar, but those, they really didn't do a whole lot. Um, there was a Sega Saturn that had come out, and I think they're talking about, I'm pretty sure, the U.S. sales of hardware and software, right? So I don't think it's worldwide. I think it's U.S. I could be wrong on that, but here in the U.S., so we had the Saturn that had come out in May of 1995, but it didn't lit the world on fire like maybe they were hoping for. And then we had the PlayStation. Now, the PlayStation became a juggernaut, right? Becoming the first system home console that sold over 1 million units. But at the time, Sony's PlayStation came out in September, and it was still kind of a newcomer. Now, it had been picking up some steam in Japan, and so then that led into people being really interested in it in the US here when it came out in September of 2000. I'm sorry, of 1995. But I initially, I think it's, if I remember right, I think it's sold pretty well. But it wasn't until a little bit later that I really feel that the system started taking off a lot when it started getting bigger names, and especially when Final Fantasy VII was announced that it was going to be on there. But that didn't happen until I believe early 1996. So again, if we're talking specifically in November 1995, we had a newcomer, PlayStation, Saturn, which wasn't quite selling as well. The Nintendo 64 wasn't out yet, and you had the fourth generation of systems that were dying out. And so that's so there was maybe not the so that was maybe kind of like a recipe all for like not for a good reason, right, to not have quite the best console sales or hot software sales, at that time. But a lot has changed since then, right? I mean, these companies are huge now, and and it's interesting. I mean, that the hardware sales were down and software or physical software sales were down that much. I think it definitely has some people concerned, right, of what could be coming up in the next several months. Next year in 2026, right, is where things might start looking a little bleak. But we'll see. I mean, it's all speculation right now. We'll see what happens, and it's if anything happens, it would be sad for me personally, just because a lot of it, we've been talking about it so much now where gaming starts to feel more corporatized and all, where it's getting away from the soul of what really made it fun was just a bunch of passionate people making passionate products, stuff that, they would want to play. Where now it seems like they're making games for what companies are forcing them to make because it's what sells. And, on that end too, also the consumer is kind of at fault too, right? We're buying up this slop. Um, but there definitely some seems to be, and I think we've all been feeling it for the past several years, that there's a certain magic that has been lost from it, and it's not just that like we're getting older, it's just that things are just changing, and this is also again with a lot of different industries too, and why a lot of people are just kind of getting disassociated with a lot of like things that we used to take for granted that used to entertain us, and why a lot of people are going back to like retro stuff or finding those like smaller companies and all that are still doing a lot of like these passion projects. And for example, like why Claire Obscure was such a big hit this year, because I think people miss that, they're yearning for that, and we're just not getting it the way we used to. Um, and so I don't know. We'll see what happens. But all that to say also is a big part of the reason why I started doing this podcast is because I've talked about it before where I'm still looking on getting some of the stuff that's coming out later, yeah, but I'm really kind of pumping the brakes on that and all, and just sort of starting to reminisce a lot and play a lot of the games that came prior to like more modern times, like let's say now, and going way back right from when I first started playing video games in the early 1980s, just because I feel like that was the big bulk of the magic of video games was during that stretch right there, and things are just getting a little too weird now and all, where I don't know if I buy into all that, because part of it is financially, but another part of it is also the passion there is just kind of missing there, and it's a bit annoying, right? But I got a backlog that is, well, I could never finish in my lifetime, and also I'm set on that, and and content with that. But it is a bit saddening and all that, a lot of the younger generation just won't be able to. I mean, they'll partake in video games and all from what's available to them now, particularly like live service stuff and all. But it's just a little sad, I guess, that it's just different now for them and all. And ultimately they're not going to miss it because they never really knew it. But it's just one of those things where I think I've talked about it before, but like that one song says, maybe it's time to let the old ways die. Maybe that is time now. Who knows? We're entering into a new era. This is old man yelling at the clouds and all, but it's things have really changed. So things have changed, and I think a lot of us feel it. It's in the air, like we all feel it, and we're just going through the motions now, as everything is just changing right before our eyes. But what can we do, right? Well, what we can do is do some reminiscing, and so let's getting our heads out of the whole modern gaming stuff now and going back in time to 1999. So the year right before the end of the millennium, right? Millennium. So we're going from. Am I saying? Oh my god, am I thinking of that term right? But basically, we're going from 1990, from the 1900s and going into the 2000s, and it was a big deal back then. We had the whole Y2K scare and all that at the end of 1999 and all. But yeah, I mean, 1999 definitely started ushering in also a new era as we started seeing what video games could become. And mainly that was because of the Dreamcast, I feel. And then just some of the stuff that was even on PC and all, I would assume. But there was just a lot of, things were it was just great. It was just great seeing all these different technological advances and all, and it was truly giving us a glimpse of the future. So we were entering into a new millennium, and then also a new generation too. And it was a great time. It was one of those times where we were excited for technology, not almost scared by it, right? Like the way things are going now. But yeah, let's get into 1999 here. So we'll talk a bit about the year overall, and then we'll get into more specifically on the games here. So with 1999, so it saw many sequels and prequels in video games such as Heroes of Might and Magic 3, System Shock 2, Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver, Final Fantasy 8, Age of Empires 2, Crash Team Racing, Spyro 2 Ripto's Rage, Grand Theft Auto 2, Resident Evil 3 Nemesis, Chrono Cross, Unreal Tournament, Pokemon Gold and Silver, and Donkey Kong 4. Or I'm sorry, Donkey Kong 64. Along with new titles such as Smash Bros., Silent Hill, Siphon Filter, Driver, EverQuest, Homeworld, Tony Hawk's Pro Skater, and Planetscape Torment. The year's most critically acclaimed video game was the Dreamcast title Soul Calibur, which remains the highest rated, which remains among the highest rated games of all time, according to Metacritic. The best-selling home video game worldwide was the Game Boy title Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow for the second year in a row, while the year's highest-grossing arcade game in Japan was Sega's Virtual Striker 2. So Pokemon was starting to become a big deal. And yeah, Soul Calibur just was something else. Let's see. So events. So British Academy of Film and Television Arts hosted the second annual BAFTA Interactive Entertainments Awards. March, Game Over: How Nintendo Zapped an American Industry, Captured Your Dollar, and Enslaved Your Children is republished as Game Over. Press start to continue. March 15th, so Game Network hosts the first annual Independent Games Festival at GDC. March 15th to the 19th, the Game Developers Conference, formerly Computer Game Developers Conference, moves to San Jose, California, where it stays for 6 consecutive years, hosts the first annual Independent Games Festival. May 12th, Nintendo has started working on what will eventually be the GameCube under the codename Project Dolphin. May 13th, Academy of Interactive Arts and Science hosts second annual Interactive Achievement Awards, inducts Sid Meier of Fire Access Games to the AIAS Hall of Fame. May 13th to 15th, the fifth annual Electronic Entertainment Expo E3, the second annual Game Critics Award for the best of E3. September 7th, the Sega World London Amusement Park shuts down for good, exactly 3 years after its original opening day in 1996. The bottom 2 floors of the park continued to operate as a generic arcade until 2011. For hardware, let's see, January 23rd, we saw the Pocket Station in Japan. And then in March 4th, the Wonder Swan in Japan. And then March 16th, the Neo Geo Pocket Color in Japan. And then in May and June, it just says here Game.com Pocket Pro. And September 9th, the Dreamcast here in North America. Top rated Game of the Year awards, or the Game of the Year awards. So a lot of this gave it to, I mean, it was kind of all over the place, but probably the more popular one, though, was Soul Calibur. So fighting game that came out on the Dreamcast. We'll talk more about that later. But Final Fantasy VIII, Electronic Gaming Monthly. Oh wait, it says they gave it to Soul Calibur and also Final Fantasy VIII. What's going on there? I'm not sure. But Game Informer gave it to Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. But Chrono Cross is also in there. So Chrono Cross was sort of like kind of like a sequel to Chrono Trigger. Great RPG. But I think that was in Japan only. Yeah, because I think Chrono Cross didn't come out in North America until next year. We'll see as I go along here. Okay, yeah, because Chrono Cross came out on November 18th of 1999 in Japan. I think, right? I don't know. Some of these dates seem off, but let's see. So for financial performance, so as far as like game consoles go, so number one was a Sony PlayStation with worldwide 21,820,000 units sold. Number two was the Game Boy/Game Boy Color with 17,450,000. Number three was the Nintendo 64 with 6,490,000. Number four was the Sega Dreamcast with 3,150,000 worldwide. Number five was the Bandai WonderSwan handheld system with 1,400,000. Number six was the Sega Genesis at 431,000. And number seven was the Super Nintendo with 280,000. Huh, so the Genesis sold better than the Super Nintendo. That's interesting. Number eight was the Nintendo Entertainment System with 50,000. Wow. Third generation system still kicking in there. And number nine was the SNK handheld system with 25,000. And number 10 was a Sega Saturn at 6,100. Yikes. It's just the Sega Saturn, man. Uh, I just say it because I love that system so much. I think it's not like I acknowledge it's not like the best system or anything like that, but there's so many damn good games for it that it's always just kind of a tragedy whenever I see just when you actually see the numbers, right, and how poorly it did. I mean, according to this, the damn Genesis beat it. That's crazy. Let's see. But the best-selling games worldwide, well, at least in Japan, United States, and Germany, according to this. And it says United Kingdom also, but let's see. So number one was Pokemon Red, Green, Blue, and Yellow, with 9,898,000 combined. Final Fantasy VIII, 4,538,000. Pocket Monsters Gold and Silver, so Pokemon Gold and Silver on the Game Boy Color for 4,444,000. Number four was Super Smash Brothers was 2,820,000. Number five, Donkey Kong 64 was 2,639,000. Number six, Pokemon Pinball with 2,565,000. Number seven was Pokemon Snap with 2,134,000. Number eight was Dance Dance Revolution with 1,904,000. Number nine was Gran Turismo at 1,634,000. And number 10 was Driver with 1,600,000. And so here in the United States, so number one was Pokemon Red, Blue, and Yellow. So this is money wise. So 550 million. Number two, and now this is what it just says inflation here, but number two was Gran Turismo with 257 million. Donkey Kong 64 with 249 million. Tomb Raider 3 with 194 million. Number 5 was Driver with 177 million. Number 6 was FIFA 99 with 173 million. Number 7 was Final Fantasy 8 with 148 million. Oh, and again, in case I didn't note it already, this is in the United States and in Europe. And then in number 8, Pokemon Snap with 140 million. Number 9, The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time with 140 million. And number 10, Super Smash Bros. With 125 million. Let's see. Okay, So just a bunch of data that kind of repeats itself here. But business, so things that happened though business wise. So there was February 22nd. So Sierra reorganizes to cut costs in what is widely referred to as the Chainsaw Monday layoffs. Oh, that sounds bad. Closing several studios and their iconic former headquarters in Oakhurst, California. Some employees were given the option to relocate to their new headquarters in Bellevue, Washington. Damn. Midway Games stops using the Arcade Games brand. New companies 3D6 Games, 7 Studios, BAM, Liquid Entertainment, Bohemia Interactive, and 7FXR Forum. Acquisition. So Activision acquires El Senior Multimedia, Expert Software, and Eversoft Entertainment. Infogames Entertainment, SA, acquires Accolade, renamed Infogames North America. Gremlin Interactive, renamed Infogames Sheffield House, GT Interactive, and Aussie Soft. Take-Two Interactive acquires Talon Soft. ZeniMax Media acquires Bethesda Softworks. And Codemasters acquires Sensible Software. Lawsuits, Nintendo versus Bung Enterprises. Nintendo sues Bung over patent infringement. And Sony Corporation versus Bleem LLC. So this one here, so I'll talk a little bit about this one here. A little bit that I recall of this anyway, so some of my facts might be wrong here, but so Sony Corporation versus Bleem. So what was this? Basically, I thought maybe it was in 2000, but maybe it started this year. But there was a software Bleemcast, I think it was called, um, and so basically it was like some kind of a software emulator where you can play PlayStation games on your Dreamcast. And so when you put it on the Dreamcast, it upscaled the games a bit. Um, and made them look a little bit better on there. But let's see. So just to give a bit of information on this. So Bleem is a commercial PlayStation emulator released by the Bleem Company in 1999 for Windows and Dreamcast. It is one of the few commercial software emulators to be aggressively marketed during the emulated console's lifetime and was the center of multiple lawsuits. So let's go over this a bit here because this is kind of important what ends up happening as far as video games in general and then also emulation and all, and because we're getting to the point now that we're a few generations into the video game industry and that people are starting to want to preserve video games because up to this point we haven't had like a whole lot of like re-release games like remasters or gaming compilations and all that kind of started becoming a thing in this generation and then took off in later generations, but up to this point it wasn't. But there was, I'm sure, people that were trying to preserve video games because we were starting to realize like, okay, we're starting to, there's been multiple consoles that have come out, how do we preserve all this? And so I'm assuming this is my assumption is that was probably one of the reasons for this. But let's go over this here because this is kind of important for later on stuff. So Bleem was a PlayStation emulator designed to allow people to play original PlayStation games on Windows 95 or 98 or on the Dreamcast. Okay, here we go. So the Dreamcast version was called Bleemcast. It was released in March of 1999. The company that developed and commercialized Bleem initially consisted of just two people, David Herpolsheimer, the president, and Randy Linden. But in the commercial phase included Will Kempe, Scott Carroll, Sean Kapanen, Brian Stokes, James Sinclair, and Paul Chen, later of Rovio Entertainment. So for context, to allow for full-speed emulation on lower-end computers of what was at the time a current generation console, the authors coded Bleem in assembly. This allowed them to create precise optimizations. Unlike Contex's commercial virtual game station, it made use of the PC's 3D graphics hardware for rendering, allowing for enhanced resolution and filtered textures not possible in real-time software rendering of the time. Bleem used low-level memory emulation and other real-mode technology. It did not function on operating systems using the Windows NT kernel, including Windows 2000. In fact, Bleem's statement at the time was that Bleem would never support running on Windows NT-based systems, as Windows 98 was the dominant operating system at the time. Sony, despite having lost its case with Connectix, continued to pursue legal action against Bleem. Bleem, financially unable to defend itself, was forced to go out of business. As of 2005, two members of the team working for Sony, Randy Linden, was working for SCEA on porting titles and looking at possibility of emulation of previous generation titles for the next PlayStation, and Sean Koppinen was promoting EverQuest 2 and Star Wars Galaxies for Sony Online Entertainment. So copy protection. 2, combat redistribution of the small downloadable emulator. The user had to buy the Bleem CD containing about 35 megabytes of data, a DirectX distributable, and the actual version of Bleem, available at the time of the CD's printing. The rest of the CD was only for copy protection and was impossible to copy by conventional means. Nevertheless, the copy protection was cracked within 2 weeks of the release. Further updates to the emulator were free until the company ceased operation several years later. Let's see, I'm trying to get to the point here where they talk about... Okay, here we go. So the Sony lawsuit. So 2 days after Bleem started taking pre-orders for their emulator, Sony filed suit over over violations of copyright. Sony had accused Bleem of engaging in unfair competition by allowing PlayStation BIOS to be used on a personal computer, as this would ultimately damage Sony's sales of the PlayStation. The judge had rejected the notion and issued a protective order to protect David from Goliath. Sony's second copyright allegation regarded the use of screenshots on their advertisements comparing the native PlayStation and emulated Bleem's versions. The district court had held in favor of Sony regarding the allegations and issued a preliminary injunction against Bleem. However, Bleem later appealed the decision, providing their use of copyright material was protected under fair use. The appeal was successful, with the court stating that the screenshots of Sony's video games rather constituted comparative advertising. In spite of the loss, the release of Bleemcast caused Sony to file another lawsuit accusing them of unfair competition and patent infringement regarding the use of PlayStation BIOS on the Dreamcast. This approach had become problematic for Bleem, despite no actual court ruling against them. The main issue regarded the financial problems Bleem had faced, as they had to deal with defense costs of $1 million per patent. This caused Bleem's work to decline, so that they only managed to release 3 games: Metal Gear Solid, Gran Turismo 2, and Tekken 3 for Bleemcast. At this point, Sony had obstructed Bleem from developing further games for the Bleemcast and had even threatened retailers selling these products. Excuse me. The legal fees forced the company out of business, and eBay auctions of some of the company's possessions were held soon after, including a huge library of worldwide game releases used for compatibility testing. So although Sony ultimately did not win any of its lawsuits against them, Bleem had to shut down when the huge court costs became too much for the small company to handle. Bleem shut down in November of 2001, the same year Sega announced that they would discontinue the Dreamcast in North America. Bleem closed their website with only an image of the front page showing Sonic the Hedgehog tearfully holding a flower next to a Bleem gravestone. However, the image was later altered and Sonic was removed, ironically to avoid lawsuit from Sega. Sega themselves had also been indirectly involved in the obstruction of Bleemcast by the way of removal of support for the unpopular, for Sega's intended use, MIL-CD format on later Dreamcast models. So let's see. So as far as legacy, though, so the case of Bleemcast software had been analyzed by legal scholars in the context of the industry's treatment of third-party emulation of video games. The lawsuit shed light on the scope of fair use in United States copyright law and the extent to which video game companies rely on anti-circumvention provisions of the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, as Sony had to drive out competing products, regardless of whether copyright had actually been infringed. Okay. So, kind of long story short, what I understand of it, because like, this kind of became a thing, right? And all going forward, right, with emulation and all. So, this is what I understand. I could be wrong on some of this. So, if you're new to gaming or are wanting to get back into video games and you're hearing all these things about emulation devices now and all like the Retroid Pocket, all the Ambernic devices out there, the Odin 2, even the Steam Deck and things like that. So you're hearing about emulation, right? What is this all about? Is it legal to do and all that? First of all, do your own research on it because again, I can only provide so much information, but this is kind of where it started, right? And basically my understanding is emulations or emulators are legal, the software itself, right? So emulators are basically like a software that emulates a hardware. This is very basic terms. There's a lot of great like YouTube content creators and all that. They can go into this a lot more in detail, right? But that's basically what it is. It emulates a software. So the emulation of where you're emulating a console, that itself in itself is not illegal. Um, it's never been fully tested in court. So for like example, this one, Sony lost, but the only reason Bleamcast went out is because again, they just ran out of money and the court costs were too high. So it hasn't been like fully contested in court. Like even Nintendo that goes after a lot of companies, to my understanding, they never really actually like it's never like there's never been a definitive decision made on it because it never went that far into the court case because a lot of companies that are doing emulations and all that, it's just too expensive to try to fight against like, well back then Sony and especially now Nintendo, right? There's just too much cost involved in it. And also there is the risk that if it were to go all the way that there might be a court that would decide that emulators are then illegal. But as of right now, the emulation itself is not illegal. What is considered like illegal is, for example, like if you're getting like the BIOS of a system. So BIOS, I forgot what it stands for, but it's more or less like the operating system that like a console uses, right? That makes it run. So like for some emulators, you need to also download or have access to a BIOS so that you can start up the emulator. And that right there is that BIOS is what can be considered illegal use if you're downloading it illegally. There's ways you can dump like the BIOS from a system. There's a procedures for that depending on your system. I don't know how to do that specifically, but even then, right? That's where it's entering into this gray area. Same thing with like video games. So you can dump the ROM of your game, and there's methods to do that. But how you acquire those ROMs, though, and all that's where can be a gray area or illegal, right? So, like if you're dumping your own ROMs for using your own purposes, that seems to be more widely accepted. But if you're downloading the ROMs off of the internet somewhere without you having to purchase the product, that is illegal, right? That is considered illegal. So that's why a lot of times if you start trying to go down the emulation rabbit hole, like, okay, so I got my emulator set up, I got my device, it's all good to go. Where do I get the games? That's why a lot of people will say, I'm not going to tell you where to get the games because that's on you, right? If you want to dump your own ROMs, there's methods to do that. There's like devices you can buy that helps you dump the ROM of a game, whether if it's a cartridge based or CD based, or if you're going to acquire them illegally, right, from the internet, because I mean, there are sites out there that do that, but that's where it gets into a very illegal area there. And why, like, for example, if you hear Nintendo going after emulations or emulators and things like that, it's because they're going after sites that specifically have ROMs on their site to distribute, and if they're profiting from it somewhere, and the bigger that they get, the more common that they're going to get taken down. So that's where, again, that's kind of a very basic overview of what emulation is. So if you were to try to get into emulation, just kind of know that going into it, going into it, right? Again, quick recap, my understanding of it. Emulation software are legal because you can even download a bunch of them, for example, like on the Android store, if you have like an Android device, right? If you just Google like Super Nintendo emulator, you're going to find stuff on there. Sega Genesis emulator, you're going to find stuff on there. PlayStation emulators, you're going to even find stuff on official, legitimate sites or storefronts. Obtaining the BIOS that in a lot of cases some emulators need to run, and the ROMs themselves, which is basic. When I say ROMs, I mean the games themselves. That's where it's illegal. So FYI, right? If you're starting to get into that, and this is kind of where it was starting, right? I remember the Bleemcast because I think my brother got it at the time, or he had a friend that let him borrow it, and we tried out Metal Gear on it, and it looked amazing. It really looked pretty much like a remaster, right? And I remember that's where I started getting into that concept of a remaster. Like, here's a game that I really liked on a previous generation, and it looks really cleaned up. The more higher resolution textures and all that. And I was like, wow, this is actually really cool. But then the whole thing was Bleem happened, right? And all in its lawsuit against Sony. So again, this is where it gets into this gray area that even to this day, it is still very a highly controversial topic as far as like emulators and things like that. So that is my little spiel on that whole thing there. This is what I will say though, as far as this goes, as far as what I personally do. Don't follow what I do unless, it's up to you, right? Basically. But for me, I do believe in supporting a product if it's something that I really like or that I really want, right? Um, if I want to buy a game, if I want access to a game, I'm going to look first to see if I can buy it somewhere. And whether that's on one of the modern consoles, like for example, the eShop, Xbox, or on the PlayStation storefront. If it's there and if it's something that I really want, I will happily pay to support that developer, right? Because as a once wannabe artist, right? And I understand that you work hard for this stuff and all, and so you want to get compensated for it if you're in the business of making money off of what art you're producing. I do believe in paying people for that product, right? But at the same time, the video game industry is very tricky as far as how to redistribute their product because, like music and movies, using those as an example, you can play music like say like if you were to get a cassette, right, for music, as long as you have a cassette player, it should play. If it's on a CD, as long as you have a CD player that can play CD-ROMs, you can play it. Or now it's available to stream, and to stream it, you don't need like unique a unique format to be able to stream your music or download it, right? As long as you have just your basic computer or music playing device or whatever, right? You can play it. It's not that complex, right? Same thing with movies. If you have a VHS around, right, then you can watch a VHS movie. If you have a DVD, as long as you have a DVD player that can play, then and so forth, right? So there's not like it doesn't require unique hardware specifically, right, to play a specific movie. As long as you have just it's more of a unified. There are more unified formats on that you can play them on, or if you're streaming, right? As long as you have a good internet connection and the software that like Voodoo, for example, and then you have a hardware device that can stream it, then you're good. Video games are different though because the games that were built for a specific system is specific to and unique to that hardware. And so it's not like it's a unified thing where you can just play like, okay, I have a game and I can play it on one specific hardware. It's not like that. I mean, going way further back in the day, that's kind of what 3DO was trying to do, where it was trying to be the one video game console where you can play all your games. That failed, but that was the idea behind it, right? Like, why do you have to get a Nintendo system to play a Mario game? That seems silly, according to Trip Hopkins. And I can understand to an extent that sentiment, but that's the challenge with video games, is that they're built specifically for their hardware, and especially when you get to more unique systems, like, for example, the Wii. The Wii was very specific to that hardware mainly because of the control scheme, right? I mean, playing a Wii game emulated, sure, you can make it look nice and all, but controlling the game is very different unless you have either the original Wiimote or you have a way of emulating that, right? Like if you buy like a third-party Wiimote and things like that. Otherwise, sure, you can customize the controls on a control pad. It's just not going to feel the same though, because it was very unique to that hardware. And then as technology has changed and got more powerful, emulating the games is more difficult. So another little tip here, if you're getting into emulation, for the most part, you can emulate pretty spot on.
right? There with some glitches here and there and all, right? But in some cases, but for the most part, pretty spot on up until the sixth generation of gaming consoles. So all the way from the first generation all the way up to the sixth generation. I mean, minus the Xbox, because the Xbox, it's a bit tricky to emulate that, and there's emulators out there for it, but they're just they're not the best though right now, and so it just seems like there just hasn't been time and money and all of my assumption, right, to really put effort into that to get the emulation of the Xbox really spot on. But otherwise, from like the Magnavox going, going back to Pong or the Pong, well, I guess maybe the first generation, it might be a little tricky just because that was a very unique console, right? Where you had like those overlays you would place on your screen. And so I guess that would be a bit difficult to emulate, but just technologically, it'd be very easy to emulate those games. But then going from like the second generation to Atari and Television, ColecoVision, and all the way up until the Dreamcast, PlayStation 2, and GameCube. You can emulate those as long as you have a decent enough device. You can emulate them pretty spot on. Once you get to the Xbox, though, which is still its sixth generation, but again, that one's a bit trickier to emulate. And then you start getting to the seventh generation, like the Wii, the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360. Yes, you can emulate those. The Wii, again, the difficult challenge with that is, again, the hardware, the controller setup on it. The PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360, they've made a lot of strides as far as emulation, but they're still, it's still not perfect though, but they're getting a lot better. Then you start getting into the eighth generation, and then like the Switch, the Wii U, you can emulate those pretty well as long as you got the right device for it. But again, the challenge with those there is Nintendo kind of making it difficult, right, with shutting down a lot of emulators. And then there's been some strides to emulate some PlayStation 4 and Xbox One games, but again, it's in its early phase still, so don't feel like you're going to be emulating like. I mean, Bloodborne, apparently they've been able to get off the ground running, from my understanding, pretty well, but don't feel like you're going to be emulating like Spider-Man on the PlayStation 4, right? And all right off the bat. There's still effort being put into that. And then, of course, not like the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. My understanding of it, right? So just kind of understand that going into it, as if you're starting to get into emulation. Um, but basically my point though is that again that's the challenge with preserving video games, is that it's unique to the hardware, and so it's not like a unified format across the board, right, and all, where you can just play a video game on like one hardware or whatever, right? I mean you have to, I mean, yes, you can get like, if you have like a really badass PC and you get all the best emulators on there, then that's one way. But again, each system has a specific emulator that you need to get. And then how those emulators perform is different from system to system. Like, for example, for many years, the original PlayStation was, people were able to emulate it. It took a while. No, I'm sorry. Okay. So the PlayStation was fairly easily emulated from a long time ago, and also the Dreamcast. And the Dreamcast was a sixth generation system. But it took a while for people to be able to get the Saturn emulator up and going, where it could emulate things pretty well. And even to this day, the Saturn emulation has gone quite far. Like I can emulate pretty much most games on my Odin 2 for the most part, but it took a while to get there, right? And it takes more power from the Odin 2 to emulate well than say like the PlayStation or even the Dreamcast can. So again, it's that's what makes it challenging, is how these hardwares were built back then. Um, and so anyway, so that's been the issue, right, with preserving video games and all. And unfortunately, because they're tied to licenses and company rights and copyrights and all that, that's where it makes all this emulation just really tricky in video games, to preserve video games. And why probably, like a few years ago, why Congress shut it down, right, to try to have some kind of a video game preservation library, because probably because of things like that, they're tied up in all these legal loopholes and copyrights and all kinds of a big mess with all these different systems that have been out for the past, 40 years or whatever, that it makes it tricky to try to preserve all this. So again, I kind of went off on a bit of a tangent there, but that's just my take on it for emulation. So what I'm getting at, also what I was saying earlier, as far as my stance on it, if a video game is out that I want to get, and if it is out to buy, I will happily pay for it, right? If I'm within the means to do so. But if there's something that I really want to get, that I feel it's important to preserve to some extent, but if it's not out there to buy commercially, then that is where I feel emulation is warranted. Again, that is a moral kind of gray area. You choose, you do you. But that is kind of how I feel. And because a lot of these things are just getting so lost in time that it just makes it difficult to try to preserve these things when they're just not being sold outright. I mean, things like, probably the two biggest examples for me personally that I can think of is Panzer Dragoon Saga and Snatcher. Panzer Dragoon Saga on the Sega Saturn and Snatcher, well, the Sega CD version, and two highly influential, very creative, important video games that unfortunately have been kind of lost to time because there's just not a way to buy them commercially. Um, but that's kind of where my stance on it. If you are trying to get into emulation, because again, of all these devices that are coming out, that's sort of my spiel on it and all. But do your research and you do you on that. Basically, is I guess what I'm trying to get at. But okay, yeah, it kind of went off a bit there longer than I thought I was going to be on that, but just thought it was important to discuss that as we start moving forward with all this here. But let's talk about now just video games in general, because there was a lot of cool stuff came out this year. And let's see. So we're gonna go into here for the specific video games. So the PlayStation had a pretty good year here. Um, we had games like Ape Escape, which was a fun little it's a silly game where you play like this spiky haired kind of anime dude and you're going around with a net and bashing these monkeys on their head with a lightsaber and then catching them with a net. It's actually really fun and addicting if once you kind of get more into it. But kind of made it, again, that the Sony could or the PlayStation could be like a family friendly sort of system as well too, right? Because it has sort of a kind of like almost like a Nintendo feel to the game as far as like its character designs, its overall appeal, and things like that. I don't know how well it sold, but it seemed to be fairly popular, for a PlayStation brand. We had Crash Team Racing, which was just following up on the Crash Bandicoot series, but going in a different direction, where this was sort of like a Mario Kart inspired game. And I haven't really played too much of it, but it seems fun the little bit that I have played of it. But it definitely seems to have a big following, as a lot of people seem to prefer this game over Mario Kart. So, Naughty Dog was, I mean, they're great developers, or they were back then, and this just kind of shows, right, that they can not only do platformers but also racing games. Well, like silly cartoon like combat racing games. But for more serious racing fans, there was Gran Turismo 2 that came out also this year, well, North America at least. And, the first one set a standard. Gran Turismo 2 really, really was a big deal. And it's either Gran Turismo or Gran Turismo 2 that is the best selling game on the PlayStation. One or the other. But both of them were just big hits and just kind of took more of the same, right, from what the first Gran Turismo was, but more cars, more customization options, more tracks, has like an arcade mode too. I'm pretty sure this is where they introduced rally racing also. And yeah, I mean, for what it is, the game was pretty great. I just remember my brother and a friend of his just locking themselves in a room for a while and just playing this game over and over and over. I remember they would come out like, "Oh, almost got that license," and so yeah, for people that were into those kind of games, it was a big deal. Gran Turismo 2, great license soundtrack also too. But then we also had Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. And this was a big deal here. The Tony Hawk games became huge for a period of time there. And this is the first one that came out originally on the PlayStation. And what makes these games so much fun, I didn't really care for it at first, but then it wasn't until the third part three that I started getting into it. But basically, it's just so much fun just trying to pull off like these tricks that it kind of gets you like into that cool kind of rhythm you get into a video game, right? And all where it's like it's really testing your skill, and as you improve, and then it becomes so addicting that it just really hooks you that way. And so it was the third one that I really got into, but then I went back to part one and two and started really appreciating what those games were. And yeah, I mean, they became just hugely popular and um, great controls. Has the skateboarding in general, right? It's going to attract a certain big audience. A great licensed soundtrack, and kind of started its own little niche genre too. I mean, I guess you can consider it a sports game, but then it's kind of its own thing. Has a lot of cool little objectives you can do in a stage, and yeah, like I said, just for me, the big lure of the game was just trying to get the high score on pulling off all these crazy combos you can do, and linking them all together. It was just so much fun, and yeah, Tony Hawk games are they're just hella fun. Um, and yeah, this is where the first one started out. Going back to this one, it's a little rough. Again, the graphics are a bit rough on it and all, but the gameplay is still there for sure. And yeah, just a great time with the Tony Hawk games. And I mean, it's so much so that people were considering this like one of the best games of the year, right? Not just a like an extreme like sports game, right? That just only appeals to those fans. No, it was like having mass appeal, and it was so that's why I think the Tony Hawk games were kind of a big deal, and this is where it started. But we also got like a spy espionage action game in Siphon Filter. Siphon Filter, I remember I got this game around the same time. This along with Silent Hill, which I'll talk about here in a bit later. And I remember, I played both of them around the same time. And so Siphon Filter, in a way, it kind of started introducing like third person perspective action games, so which are very common now. But it was trying to do it back then, and the concept of the game is pretty cool. It plays kind of like a as far as like the story and the setting goes, kind of like a I don't know, almost like a Mission Impossible, I guess. You're a secret agent and you're trying to stop the terrorists, right, from unleashing this siphon filter virus. If I remember the story, okay. The story itself is okay, right? I mean, this game came out shortly after Metal Gear Solid. Now that game had a crazy good story to it, right? Where this one just feels a bit more generic, but was still fun though. And the gameplay, it's fun. I kind of played it again recently just to do like a YouTube short video of it. And it's the controls are a bit rough on it. I mean, they were still trying to figure out, controlling a character in a 3D space. And like for example, you use like the two, I think the left and right triggers to strafe left and right, and so it feels a bit weird, but still fun though, and very ambitious, I would say, right, for what they were trying to do at the time. And so for that, it gets some kudos for it, and it has some fun objectives in the levels too. So it is a fun game, and yeah, just I mean, I'd say it's worth playing if you can get over the control scheme, right, and just kind of understand that it was a different time and they hadn't quite figured out third person perspective shooting controls. um, if anything, it's worth playing just to zap someone with a taser and and just watch them burn. It's kind of funny. Um, but yeah, but Siphon Filter. But we also had a sequel now to Spyro called Spyro 2 Repto's Rage. I haven't played this one, so I don't know too much about it. I just know it was pretty well received too. So kind of more of the same, but not a bad thing. So sort of like the Crash Bandicoot games, right? I know we got 1, 2, and 3 on that series, and they were all great. Spyro started doing its own thing with all of them being pretty great, and I don't really know which one is like the more beloved one in the series, but I just know that all three of them were, pretty well received. We got this game called Jammer Lammy, which I believe is part of the Parappa the Rapper series, which I don't know if I talked about Parappa the Rapper in a previous episode. But if I didn't, then that was a pretty popular game where it was like a music rhythm based game. And so this was, I think, like a sequel to it, where the character Jammer Lammy, I guess, she plays like a guitar, if I'm right. I could be wrong on that, but it was within that same kind of vein of game there. Let's see. But then we also got the excellent Legacy of Kain Soul Reaver. And so Soul Reaver, so this was like a sequel to the Blood Omen Legacy of Kain game that came out in, I believe, 1995 or 96. I don't know if I talked about this game in a previous episode, but Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, just quick recap on that one. It was a top-down 2D action RPG game. You control this vampire Kain, and as you're just going through this adventure, right through like a medieval vampire gothic sort of setting to it. Uh, this game is a sequel to it, where now Kane is. I mean, he was like an anti-hero in the first one, but in this one, he's very much the bad guy. And you control Kane, who's one of his minions, but then gets kind of screwed over by Kane, and so then you're on a mission, kind of like a revenge story. And Legacy of Kane Soul Reaver to this day still has some of the most excellent acting in it. It is just like when Kane and Raziel and Kane meet up for the well, not for the first time, but like the first time since their last encounter, like about one third way of the way through the game. It is such a powerful dialogue that these two have, and still one of my favorite like story moments in a video game. And just it's kind of like a Metroidvania, and it's done pretty well in that sense. The combat to the game is a bit weak nowadays, but still fun. But the puzzles and the I guess what you can consider like dungeon layouts and some of the bosses and all, are still a lot of fun. And there was a recent re-release of the game and all that cleans up the graphics and all. That's pretty cool to go through. So yeah, I mean, Legacy of Kain, it's a great game. Again, combat is kind of weak in it, kind of a product of its time for that. But I still feel like if you think you can enjoy like a very gothic sort of vampire story and all with Metroidvania elements, I think it's worth checking out. Also, like if you are a fan of Anne Rice. So Anne Rice, she, rest in peace. She was a really great author that wrote the excellent Interview with the Vampire Chronicle stories. They made a movie of it, The Interview with the Vampire, years ago, back in the 90s with Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt. And if you like that kind of like vampire lore and story and all, I think you can appreciate this one because the writing kind of seems a little similar to it. And funny enough, so it was Anne Rice that wrote the novels for the Vampire Chronicles. Amy Henning was the one that mainly wrote like for the Legacy of Kain games. At least she had a big hand in it, to my understanding. And I feel like she has kind of a similar style. And so I would say that the games are worth playing for that there. But yeah, a great series, and yeah, this one's probably my favorite one in the whole series. And so yeah, originally came out on the PlayStation, and then we had some like I guess survival horror games. We had a Dino Crisis, which Dino Crisis is very much like Resident Evil, only with dinosaurs. I mean that more or less what it is. Only now, instead of using pre-rendered backdrops, it was the full background environments were 3D polygons also, more or less for better or worse results. I guess I can take them or leave them one way or the other. But it was still pretty cool though. It's again, instead of zombies, you're fighting dinosaurs, so it was a pretty cool concept. And it's typical cheesy Capcom story, but it was pretty cool. But I do remember though that the puzzles in this were hard though. I do remember struggling with some of that. They were more intense than like one of the Resident Evil games. But still a cool game though. But speaking of Resident Evil, we also got Resident Evil 3 Nemesis. And so this game was kind of a weird one where this game was originally going to be a spin-off game to the Resident Evil series because it takes place still in Raccoon City, but it takes place around the events of Resident Evil 2. So as Leon and Claire were doing their thing in Raccoon City, Jill Valentine in this one is kind of doing her thing in another section of the city. And so some of their story beats overlap a bit, but then her adventure kind of goes off in a different direction. And but they more or less end at this in the same way, I guess you can say, with the events that happen in part two, more or less. Well, no, well, kind of, right? You have to play them to kind of, I guess, see what I'm talking about on that. But basically, it plays more or less like the other Resident Evil games. Again, your pre-render backdrops, you're solving puzzles, taking out zombies. But this one is a bit more emphasis, has more action in it. You get more. There's just more action scenes in it. It's still a survival horror in a sense that you still got to get weapons and all. It's limited and all, but just has more like action set pieces, I guess. And the scary part of this game, or I guess what keeps the tension up, is that you get this character or this villain named Nemesis, who's like a big hulking zombie-like creation from Umbrella that's stalking you throughout the game. That is what kind of ranks up the cranks up the tension factor in this game. And it's pretty fun for that, but because it started going a little bit more like action oriented, is where I feel like this one wasn't quite as good as like the part one or two. And but it doesn't, it has a few new gameplay elements, like you can combine or use a tool to like make more ammo, or you have like a the dodge mechanic. I mean, I don't know, the way the dodge mechanic on this works is a little weird, but you do have a dodge mechanic in it now, and just a more variety of weapons. And also, I mean, it's definitely a worth a playthrough. It's definitely fun. But you can kind of tell though that the it felt more like a spin-off than the next big Resident Evil game. And so my understanding is that it was going to be a like a side story, but because Sony had some kind of exclusivity to the series, where like at least the next main entry games were to be on the Sony PlayStation. This one ended up getting called Resident Evil 3 because of that. But my understanding was what came out, I think, next year, Resident Evil Code Veronica, that was technically Resident Evil 3. But because that game came out originally exclusively on the Dreamcast, and we'll talk more about that game next year, um, that's why they had to go with naming this one Part 3, even though it was technically like a side story game, right? If they, if I'm making any sense of that. But that's kind of my understanding of it. But, for what it is, it's still a decent game, though. But then we get Konami throwing their head in the ring on their attempt on a survival horror game with Silent Hill. Now, Silent Hill, we're starting to see some like games inspired by Resident Evil. So, for example, like Dino Crisis, right? And Silent Hill, though, was one that took kind of a different approach. It's still a survival horror game. You're limited on ammo. It's the game is still scary, but the scare factor in this game is different. Where in the Resident Evil games, it's about zombies chasing you and all, and the Dino Crisis game, right? You got dinosaurs chasing you and all, and so that's kind of the scare factor about it. Silent Hill is different, where it's more of a psychologically scary game, and because the enemies that you're fighting in this are very different, and it's the setting and the atmosphere of Silent Hill that makes it very uncomfortable to play at times, where it just kind of messes with your mind with the usage of how it uses sound, visuals, the foggy setting to the town of Silent Hill. And the story is more personal, where you're a father on a road trip with your daughter, and then you crash, and then your daughter gets lost, and you're out to try to find her. So it's not like this big stakes thing where you're trying to uncover a evil corporation, right, and their experiments that they're doing. This is more just you trying to find your daughter, and then the kind of like dark hole, rabbit hole that you go into as you explore this demented town. So in that sense, it felt very different, even though technically the gameplay is still kind of the same, where you have the tank controls, you're solving puzzles, things like that. And even though it uses 3D backgrounds instead of pre-rendered, the control scheme is more or less the same. Um, but again, it's the atmosphere, the setting, the approach to the storytelling, and all that really differentiated it from the Resident Evil games. And so then now you got like two heavy hitters in this genre of survival horror with Resident Evil, and then now the newcomer Silent Hill. Because Silent Hill kind of in that genre, but a different take on it, right? So almost like, I know, a weird comparison, but Sonic and Mario, they're two technically platformers, but two very different approaches, right? And so it was great. I mean, and that's why I always feel like competition brings out the best in a lot of companies, as these were two very excellent style of games. And we were, it was good. I mean, Silent Hill was a very excellent game, and the music to it also is just so atmospheric and intense and all, and really gave it an identity or helped give Silent Hill an identity, because it all kind of blends together, right? Was this Team Silent Hill, I believe is what it was called, which was like a subdivision of Konami that were responsible for like the first several entries in the series. And their first game was just, I mean, it was truly something special. And again, I played this game and Siphon Filter almost back to back, because I remember I bought them back then in somewhat early 1999, if I recall right. Yeah, just this particular game here. I remember after I beat it, I was like, "This is different. This is cool." It was uh definitely was a very creative game and creepy game, and yeah, it was just a cool overall experience. And yeah, Silent Hill was a great game. Um, but we also got Street Fighter Alpha 3. And now Street Fighter Alpha 3 might have come out the previous year in the arcades, but what I'm going to talk about here is starting off with the PlayStation version came out later on the Dreamcast, I believe this year. If not this year, maybe early next year. But this was on the Dreamcast. I'm sorry, on the PlayStation. So Street Fighter Alpha 3 didn't come out on the Saturn in the United States. That run, because again, the Saturn was already on its way out, but it came out on the PlayStation. And so I remember I really liked Street Fighter Alpha 2. And so I was like, okay, so here's the next one up, but it's on the PlayStation because, back then the 2D fighters were generally better on the PlayStation, or I'm sorry, on the Saturn. But I got it on the PlayStation and immediately fell in love with this game. It is still to me to this day the best 2D fighting game of all time. My favorite fighting game of all time. And what I love about this game is that it takes us the foundation of like the Alpha Street Fighter Alpha 1 and 2, but gives you more characters. Um it gives you three different play modes with the Vism, I believe Xism, and Sism, or I forgot what they're called. But basically, you can customize your character in a way. Like, for example, if you pick one version where you have really powerful attacks and one super strong move, but you take more damage as you get hit, or you get the Alpha Ism, which it's kind of a middle ground, and then you get the V-ism where you can do like these hyper combos, right? If you select to do the V-ism thing. Um, and so I love that concept there, right? That you can kind of customize your character in a way. And again, more characters. The gameplay is still super tight, and you get air blocks to also still have the alpha counters. And a lot of with the new roster of characters, especially if you know, some of the later iterations of this game where you have a huge amount of characters you can pick, and it was just a total blast to play with some really amazing music to also the great animation that you would expect from a CPS2 Capcom fighting game. And it just made for an overall amazing package. And then it also had I believe on the PlayStation it had like a world tour mode where you take on a bunch of fighters, has a little bit of a story to it and all. And so it just made it for an awesome package overall, on a solid gameplay fighting game. And yeah, Street Fighter Alpha 3, favorite fighting game of all time. Not particularly this version on the PlayStation, but it was still a pretty good version. But it does have some loading time and all that kind of annoyed me. But again, some of the later versions really, you don't have to really deal with that. But just the game itself, Street Fighter Alpha 3, is just an absolutely amazing time. And one of my comfort food games where I always like going back to and just play, just love having a blast with that game. And it's just so amazing. And yeah, again, at the very least, the PlayStation version came out this year. But I think the arcade thing came out last year, I think. Um, but for me personally, my favorite game of the year, and this is kind of a bias, right, that I have towards this series, but was Final Fantasy VIII. I'm pretty sure that was my game of the year this year. But Final Fantasy VIII is, the follow up to Final Fantasy VII, and Final Fantasy VIII was a bit of a weird one where, I mean, it had, these high expectations, right? That it was gonna, follow up on the success of Final Fantasy VII. And financially, yeah, I mean, it didn't sell as much, but it was still one of the highest selling PlayStation games. But it's a different Final Fantasy. They really started going in a different direction, starting with this one. It like it was kind of leaning more towards realism in a sense. I mean, you still have a lot of high fantasy elements to it for sure, but you like control squad who's part of a school and you're part of an elite group from this school called Seed. Excuse me. There's a bit of like almost like high school friendship and romance kind of elements to the story. So it felt a little different for that, right? And this is where Final Fantasy kind of started splitting up a bit as far as like the people behind the scenes. because there was a little bit that I understand of it. So there was Hironobu Sakaguchi, who had been, the main head of Final Fantasy games for a long time, and then also um, Yoshiro Kitase. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing his name right, but then he started getting involved as far as like being like the director of or main producer of a lot of these Final Fantasy games going forward, and they had a very different style. If you to put it to perspective, look at Final Fantasy 8 and then look at Final Fantasy 9. They came out next year. Very drastic differences, right? Where one is more lends towards more the realism side, where Final Fantasy 9 lends a lot more towards the fantasy side. And so you can kind of see like their differences in style. Eventually, Kitase's version ended up winning out, as that seemed to be the style that would sell more and kind of what we ended up getting in later Final Fantasy games. But initially it was a bit divisive though. And I remember when I was playing this game, I didn't like it at first too much. I was forcing myself to like it just because I was a huge fan of Final Fantasy 6 and 7. And so it's one of those games where you're almost telling yourself like, I'm the one that's wrong. I need to like this game because I'm sure it's good. I'm just maybe misunderstanding something. But then I didn't like it after a while. I was like, no, 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 this game is not that great. But then I went back to it, and then I really ended up enjoying it. So I don't know. I had an up and down with this game and all, but my final verdict on this game was that I very much ended up liking it. That so much so that again, it is my favorite game of this year. Didn't like it as much as Final Fantasy VII for sure, but but I liked it enough though that it's still a very good game, and I'm glad that one of the things that made Final Fantasy so appealing was that you were going to get something different with each new entry, and for better or worse. But it kept the series fresh for a long time because of that. Because you were going to get a brand new story, a brand new world, a brand new everything, brand new mechanics and all. And again, this one really, really went in a different direction with its story and also its gameplay with the whole junction system thing. I remember our brother used to say something. I was like, "Why do you like that conjunction junction? What's your function game?" But something about it though still, I had a. It's I still ended up really resonating with the story. Squall tends to be a main character in a Final Fantasy game that is kind of looked down on, but I really related to Squall as a big introvert and all, and having a lot of self dialogue. I could really get into that character Squall, and I think that's one of the main things that ultimately still kept me hooked on the game enough that I ended up liking it was because of him. Um, and so just made it for I just really ended up enjoying that game. The graphics, the story, the gameplay eventually ended up liking. The music to it is really great too also. And just had a lot of cool moments in the game that it just made it really unforgettable for me, even if it feels a bit unconventional for what a Final Fantasy game was at the time. But in retrospect, when I look back on it, it is a fine game and I really do enjoy it. But then on the Nintendo 64 side, so just gonna kind of go through these here real quick, as I don't have a whole lot of experience with them. But there was like Rayman 2: The Great Escape, which was a pretty popular game on the Nintendo 64. One of the things they did really well was for 3D platformers, and so this is where I believe it got its start on. Eventually, this game did come out on the Dreamcast, and that's the better version to play, as it looks a lot better too, also. But the 64 version is just fine as well too. It was recently released on the Nintendo Switch Online too. But we also had Donkey Kong 64, which I know this game was kind of highly controversial, but just because I don't really know why. I think just because there's just a whole lot of stuff to collect. I don't know. Excuse me. But it came out this year and apparently has a pretty cool little rap song at the beginning. And then there was Super Smash Bros. So this was a very interesting concept that really blew up later with later entries, but it was where you are able to fight with a bunch of classic Nintendo characters. So, like, Mario taking on Samus or Link taking on Pokemon, right, for example. And the roster was pretty limited at the time, but what we eventually got used to. But it was still pretty cool, right, to be able to do that where you're fighting against these classic Nintendo characters and made it for a really fun party game because it's a 4-player game and all. And so I'm sure it was a big blast for, a lot of people back then. They got to play this. This series only blew up in later entries and all, but this is where it got its start. And I've played a bit of this one. It's fun. It's just that it's one of those series where future installments just improved on it so much that it's like when you go back to this one, it just seems very basic. But the core gameplay is still there, and it's still a lot of fun for that. And I wish that they would release this on the Nintendo Switch Online service along with Donkey Kong 64, so I can see what the hell that game's all about. But it was a pretty big year for PC also. Again, I don't have a whole lot of experience with these games, so I can't speak much on them. So I'm just going to kind of run through here. But just to kind of give you an idea of what PC gaming was during this year. So for those of you that were PC gamers, I'm sure maybe a lot of these games will resonate with you. But we had things like Unreal Tournament, which I know was a big deal for like first-person shooter multiplayer. Homeworld, which I'm not sure what that is, but then System Shock 2, which I know that was like a very atmospheric kind of first person game. Then I'm actually curious to check out System Shock 1 and 2. Descent 3, Grim Fandango, which I know was a fun sort of point and click adventure. Kind of with almost like seems like a Dia de los Muertos kind of story to it. So the whole setting of that game and all just really intrigues me that I want to play that game at some point. But Sid Meier's Alpha Centauri, which is like some kind of a strategy game, and then Ultima Online, the second age. So we're starting to get into like online multiplayer games. So yeah, I just like I said, I don't have a whole lot more info on those. I just know that they were a big deal for PC gamers back then. But I'm gonna finish off here with talking about the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was, Sega failed and bowed out of the console race, not because of the Dreamcast, but because of a lot of failures that they had done leading up to the Dreamcast. The Dreamcast was really kind of like a Hail Mary that they were doing. And it was a hell of a Hail Mary, though. But if you don't know much about it, right, you might know that Sega got out of the console race because of the Dreamcast, and so maybe you think that the Dreamcast was a failure, especially if you look up like the sales numbers and all. Well, the Dreamcast didn't sell that well, so that must have been what caused Sega to fail. Well, not necessarily, right? I mean, like I said, Sega was making so many mistakes up to this point. Going back to like when the Saturn was coming out, and even a little bit before that, the 32X, and even to some extent the Sega CD and all. But they were just making a lot of decisions and all, and just that when what they should have been doing is focusing more on their software instead of just trying to pump out a bunch of different hardware. Because I mean, they were doing like the 32X, the Sega Channel, the Sega CD, the Sega Saturn eventually, and so like they were really spreading themselves thin, and even then they still had some excellent games. Like I still feel the Saturn has some excellent games, but then they were just trying to do a little bit too much, I feel, all at once, and a lot of these things that they were doing were just failing, and they just couldn't. And then also, just the Sony PlayStation blew up as well too. Also, but there's a really great documentary regarding this story here, as far as why Sega failed. It's on a channel called Pandemonium, I think, and if you Google like Pandemonium or on YouTube, anyways, Pandemonium and Fall of a Titan, I think is what the video is called. It is really excellent. Where a few years ago, there was some kind of a Sega insider that leaked a lot of information as far as how Sega was doing financially. And it really paints a big picture of actual numbers. And they were just doing horrible. I mean, they were releasing so much hardware and all that wasn't selling. And like it shows like there's documentation of like just warehouses full and full of like 32X systems and games that weren't selling and all. And so they were just bleeding money. And so many things, right? And all that happened with Sega, and then the Saturn too, also how that was handled. And so by the time that the Dreamcast came out, it really was kind of like a Hail Mary. Like, okay, let's put out a really great system. We're putting it all on the Dreamcast, and let's just see where it goes. And I mean, ultimately, the Dreamcast, for what it was, is an excellent system. I mean, I'll get more into it in the later, in the next couple of episodes. But basically, the Dreamcast came out in the North America in September 9th of 1999, and I think it was like in early 2001 where the Sega announced that they were bowing out of the console race. So that was just a little over a year that they were on the market, at least here in the United States, until they bowed out. But the legacy that they left behind was pretty immense, right? For like anybody that's a video game enthusiast. So they had a big impact in that time. And the Dreamcast came out of the gate swinging. I mean, it was like a boxer coming out of the ring, just throwing blows, right? And, maybe even getting a knockout at first. And it did great at first. I mean, it was, for me personally, it has the best launch lineup of every video game console. Granted, a lot of it is like more arcade sort of based games, but if we're talking about like a launch lineup where you have a lot of quality games to play that show off the power of what your system can do, I think it exceeded in that front. I don't think it. I mean, well, I mean, you could say Soul Calibur was right, but I don't. It didn't have like a Mario game or like a Breath of the Wild or a Halo, for example. But it had a lot of quality games, though, right? That again were kind of arcade based and all that, but it still stand the test of time to this day. And I mean, it like came out of the gate swinging. And I want to say that I think up until that point, it was like the fastest selling console of all time. And if not, it was amongst up there. And so, because I remember something about that, it broke a record on something to that effect there. And so, as a Sega fan, right, I was a bit bummed that because I loved my Saturn, but I knew that it was financial it didn't have a lot of market relevance. So when the Dreamcast was, when we were seeing screenshots about it in Japan, and then all the hype that it was getting when it launched here in the United States, I was very excited because I'm thinking Sega is back. We got Soul Calibur, which was just an amazing port of the arcade game. So a few months prior to the Dreamcast coming out in September, I went to an arcade and I saw Soul Calibur there, and it looked cool. It looked cool, right? It was running on the same arcade hardware, I believe, as Tekken 3 was, which was just a slightly beefed up, like let's say PlayStation, right? A little bit better, but not that much better. But it looked nice. But I remember when we got Soul Calibur and we played it at home, I remember thinking, this looks like way better than the arcade. Holy shit. And not only does it look better than the arcade, this looks better than Virtua Fighter 3 in the arcade. And I remember it was just like blowing my mind. I was like, I can't believe I am playing something like this at home. Because again, if a few episodes back, I talked about the impact of like what seeing something like Virtua Fighter was. And now here we are playing something that looks even better. And I was just so mesmerized by that right there. And Soul Calibur, not only for me, but for a lot of people, just had that effect where we were like, this is like the future, right? Like this is what home games are now going to look like, where they're better than the arcades now. So we're making a shift now. Where before I've talked about it, where going to the arcades was a cool experience because that's where you saw the highest tech stuff, right? Now it was flipping. And now we were starting to see that level of quality, if not better, at home. And that's what the Dreamcast represented at the time. And I can't fully describe inaccuracy of what that was. Seeing Soul Calibur, at home, it was just beautiful. And the game itself is really fun, right? It's a fun fighting game. It's I don't think I talked about Soul Edge in a previous episode, but that was a fun fighting game series where it's weapon based and all, and but a really great game. And but this one, it's taking the same gameplay but now running at 60 frames per second, really awesome textures and detail in the graphics and all, same great music and all. And so and then because it was a home port and it was done by Namco really knew how to do home ports where it loaded the home version up with like a lot of different modes, a lot of different secrets to unlock because you're unlocking these new characters, and also basically gave it a lot of depth, and it had like this kind of like a story mode to it. And so that so there was so much substance there to keep you hooked on. And so the combination of all of that, an amazing arcade port come to home that looks better than the arcade, so much content to it, that a Namco game was coming to a Sega system. All of that there, I think, is why this game is still one of the amongst the highest rating games of all time, according to Metacritic. I think it's like number 4 or so. And it's because I think of all of that. In retrospect, would I consider it the fourth best game of all time? No, but like I said, it was a different time, and it was just so unbelievable to see all this. So I can only imagine that a lot of reviewers, because I know a lot of people that were playing this game back then were so impacted by this game that it was just so beautiful to look at, and it was truly just giving us a glimpse of the future of what was to come here, because it was truly something else. And yeah, it just made it for an amazing time. And it's still fun to go back to and play just on its own, right? It's still a fun game, but the impact at the time and all was truly mesmerizing, especially if you were a Sega fan, because you, at that moment right there in time, in the fall of 1999, you were thinking Sega is so fucking back, and it was pretty exciting to think about that. Quick little pause there. I was just telling my girls that they got to get ready because we're gonna go take pictures with Santa Claus, and she's like, Santa Claus. That was pretty funny. But yeah, Soul Calibur, just amazing. Um, but we also had Sonic Adventure, and Sonic Adventure. So it was actually, again, it was a game that I picked on one of my Relay of Gaming games, so it was perfect timing for it. But this is another game too, also that because we got Soul Calibur and Sonic Adventure almost back to back when we got the Dreamcast right around its launch window. We didn't get it right on the 9th of September, but we got it shortly afterwards. What I remember about it was that we really wanted to get because I was living with my brother at the time. We were living with some other roommates, and so we were, excuse me, we were living in this apartment with like it was a couple, and then it was me, my brother, and a friend of ours. So there was like what 5 people living in this 2 bedroom apartment. but but I remember I wanted to get the Dreamcast, but I wasn't making a whole lot of money at the time, and so I was trying to save up money for it. But then, like about a week, I don't know, must have been like maybe a week after it launched, where my brother he went to the mall apparently, and he was like, "Dude, I got the Dreamcast." I was like, "What?" So I was pretty excited. So I was like, "Well, shit! If you got the Dreamcast, I do got enough money to buy a game." And I think he got Soul Calibur, but I went out and got Sonic Adventure. I think if I recall right. So we had those games to play back to back almost. So I had a cool fighting game and then like a Sonic game. And now Sonic Adventure, I already talked about it a little bit before, but it was, I mean, it's again, at the time, I was really just mesmerized by the graphics and the new technology and all that. But I was still having a pretty fun time with it where, in my mind at the time, a little overhyped, but I was thinking this is like the Super Mario 64 moment for the Sega. And, it was because it was a I mean, it was. You can tell that they put a lot of effort into the game to try to make it a good Sonic game on 3D, and it was. I mean, overall, I really liked it. I thought it was a lot of fun, and definitely felt like it was a good foundation that they could only build on from there. And again, because this is the first game, it's right at launch, so I can only imagine right what's going to come out in the later years, and so for that, there it had a really good impact on it. But I'm just gonna kind of go through these games here because the some of the games on the launch lineup. It's not all of them, but I think it's the ones that are the most relevant. And it was so NFL 2K. That was a big deal because it was a really good football game running at 60 frames per second. 60 frames per second. Excellent gameplay that was felt better than the Madden games and looked really had a really cool presentation to it and all, and was just absolutely amazing. The only thing that I remember of this game that was a bit of a knock on it was that the running game felt a little weak. They really improved on that on later entries, but this first one, well, it was a little bit weak, but everything else about it just felt solid. And again, just another game like, holy crap, Sega's back, they're making cool sports games now. But then also the House of the Dead, which was an excellent, light gun game. And so me and one of the roommates that we were living with, I remember we ended up getting this game, like I said, because as the weeks went on after we got the Dreamcast, I was buying trying to buy a game like every other paycheck or so. And so one of the first few games I bought afterwards was the House of the Dead. But we had gotten the I think he helped me out because we got 2 of the light guns also. So Sega didn't come out with at least not here in the United States with an official light gun, but there was I believe by Mad Catz actually that they had like their version of a light gun, and so we got 2 of them, and that was probably one of the funnest experiences that I've ever had playing multiplayer. Was those times that we would play the House of the Dead with that roommate that we had, and we just had a blast with it. And so, what was cool about it too was again, it was a new system, right? And so we had just moved into this apartment because prior to that, we just had like a small little TV, right? Like a just a small, not even a flat screen, but like a CRT TV, nothing fancy. But this friend of ours, he had a pretty decent TV. It was I mean, I want to say at the time, I think it was like a 32-inch TV, right? Which again, back then was, fairly big for, like a TV to have because he had it in his room because there was a couple that normally lived there and they had kind of their side of the apartment. And so this friend of ours, he had his bedroom on his side of the apartment. And so on his room, he had like that pretty nice TV for the time. And he was also, he was a bit of a gearhead. So he was one of our friends that really liked Gran Turismo, but he also was a big audio tech guy. Well, like he liked a lot of like getting a lot of like speakers and all that. Like he had a crazy sound system in this little truck that he had and all. So he was very much like a sound nut when it came to like having like really good equipment for that. So he had like this pretty badass stereo that he had also. And so basically we were seeing the Dreamcast on a bigger TV for the time, really nice audio setup. So it was just like the perfect timing of it that I was not only able to experience this next generation system, but in one of the best ways possible for the equipment that was available at that time. And so I remember playing the House of the Dead there in his room when he would just crank up the sound and all. And I remember thinking like, this is a way better experience than playing it in the arcades. And the light guns that we got, the Mad Catz one, they were, yeah, I mean, they were fairly accurate. I remember they weren't the best, but they were definitely fun enough. And so him and I got off of work around the same time. And so a lot of times we would just hang out in his room and all as, again, because there was the couple that we lived with there and all, and they were kind of doing their thing. And so we would be in that room quite a bit and just playing House of the Dead a lot. And we would just have a blast playing that game. And so that's a big core memory that I have of playing House of the Dead with that buddy of ours. And he wasn't too much of a gamer, but he really enjoyed that game. And, yeah, it was just a lot of fun to play through that game. Funny enough, around that time too, also is when I would sleep at night. I would sleep in the living room, and our other roommate, so the couple, so the guy, he had a PlayStation, and his PlayStation was there in the living room. And so when I would sleep there at night, because we had the Dreamcast, right? But also Final Fantasy VIII came out on 9999 and on the same day that the Dreamcast launched. And so then I would play Final Fantasy VIII at night before I went to sleep on the PlayStation they had there in the living room. So I experienced those two things almost back to back. So that was a pretty cool experience, right? That I was playing the new next gen cool thing, but also a Final Fantasy game right on the PlayStation. So that was a interesting time there and all, where kind of a I remember it was a bit of a stressful time and all. We were trying to look for another place to go live at. So luckily, these roommates of ours they were kind enough to let me and my brother live there for a bit. And so I remember being a bit stressed out though at the time and all because I wasn't making a whole lot of money, and so we were trying to save up money to get our own apartment. And um, yeah, I just remember those games there and all just kind of got my mind off of some stressful times that we were going through at the time. But yeah, the House of the Dead though too. Yeah, the House of the Dead too, not the first House of the Dead game, but the part two. That was such a fun experience. But then we also got I don't know if it came out right at launch, but Marvel versus Capcom. So this is the first one, and yeah, just a really great fighting game that kind of kept advancing more what X-Men versus Street Fighter and then Marvel Superheroes versus Street Fighter was doing. And so just added now the Capcom characters, so like Strider and Mega Man, and so just made it a blast to play through. And as far as I can see, pretty much arcade perfect. And also eliminated like a lot of the loading times too, like the previous generation had. So we were starting to see what the new technology could also do for 3D, or I'm sorry, for 2D fighting games where they look pretty much arcade perfect, but also reduce the loading times as well. So that was pretty cool. But then we also got Power Stone, which I didn't really play back then, but it was sort of like it's a kind of like an arena fighter game, and I've played it afterwards, and it's really fun. It's really fun in multiplayer. It's from Capcom, but yeah, I mean, it almost plays kind of like Super Smash Bros. In a way, where you can grab items to beat the crap out of each other and all, but you grab like these stones that if you grab three of them, it powers you up for a limited period of time, and yeah, it's a really fun game, and yeah, so again, another just a fun game that came out on the PlayStation, or I'm sorry, on the Dreamcast. And what a lot of these games had in common also was that they were running at 60 frames per second. And so that's what I was like, this is awesome, right? And all outside of Sonic Adventure, but like Soul Calibur, House of the Dead, 2, and Power Stone running at 60 frames per second was pretty awesome. But we had then also Hydro Thunder, which was like a hovercraft racing game based on the arcade. And as far as I could see, it either looked as good as or potentially better than the arcade of Hydro Thunder. And so it's a hovercraft racing game where you're on the water and racing, and it kind of goes through like really extreme sort of settings where they're really cool to look at and almost feels like you're on a Disney ride of some sort, right? Where you get like all these crazy effects happening in the background and all, and just really makes it for a fun arcade racer. Just a blast to play through. So those were some of the main standout games that came out. Again, there were some other ones, but again, just a lot of good stuff there and all to play right at launch that really showed what the Dreamcast could do. And you had some lasting gameplay with Sonic Adventure and also Soul Calibur because of all the modes that it had in order Sonic Adventure, right? That it was kind of a fairly lengthy game. But then we had like Mortal Kombat 4 Gold, which was a really good port of the arcade and looked a little bit better. But, Mortal Kombat 4 didn't have the best reputation. And then I think it came out this year also, but it was a little bit later. So they weren't launch titles, but we had Virtua Fighter 3 Tournament Battle and Street Fighter Alpha 3. I think they came out a little bit later this year. And Street Fighter Alpha 3, pretty much arcade perfect. I've seen some videos that really nitpick, like it's not quite because of this and this, but it's really minor things. But but had a lot of more modes on it and all. And for what it is, I mean, it was a great fighting game on the Dreamcast. And Virtua Fighter 3 Tournament Battle finally came out on the Dreamcast because it was a bit delayed because I think it was a launch title in Japan, but it didn't come out till later in the United States. I don't know why, but it was developed by a company called Genki. So it wasn't Sega's AM2 that normally did it. But they did a pretty good port. This version kind of gets overlooked a bit because I think that, again, technology was improving so much that it was kind of like Soul Calibur was like the new, fresh new thing. And so Virtua Fighter 3 by this point was already starting to seem a bit outdated. And this port wasn't quite arcade perfect. But when I've seen the side by sides in more recent times of the arcade version and this one, the difference is more smaller than what I originally thought. So in hindsight, Virtua Fighter 3 on the Dreamcast, it's a good port. If you want to play Virtua Fighter 3, I mean, it's really the only way you can play it like on a home version. But it's a really good port, I feel, and worth getting if you're into that series. But I remember getting that game, again, a little while after the Dreamcast launched, after having played Soul Calibur, and I'm playing Virtua Fighter 3, which is more or less, again, like the arcade experience. And I remember thinking, it's crazy how this, which was so mind blowing a few years ago, is now starting to seem a little outdated. So that is what the Dreamcast really did, was just give you like a glimpse of like what is to come in video games, right, going forward in the future. And we were getting a bit of a glimpse with that, which what I'm going to end this episode here with was Shenmue. I'm just going to touch base a little bit about this because I'm going to talk more about it next year when it came out in North America. But Shenmue first came out late in 1999 on the Dreamcast in Japan. And I remember this game being hyped up a lot, where it was like, I mean, they were talking, excuse me, they were talking about it like it was going to be like one of the best games of all time because of how realistic it was and how it played and all. And the graphics were looking pretty amazing on it. And it was being developed or headed by Yu Suzuki. And so there was, again, a lot of hype into it, that it was a lot of money being thrown into this project and all, and it was going to be like the next big thing. And so at least up until that point, ending 1999, we were riding high on the Dreamcast, and for Sega fans also, on what the future was going to bring. And it was really exciting, right? The launch lineup was amazing. We had Shenmue that just came out in Japan, was going to come out the following year. There was some things that they were announcing for the Dreamcast that all seemed exciting. And so it was all, and it was selling really well at first. And so it was exciting. It was an exciting time in that moment there. But like I said, right, there was a lot that was happening behind the scenes that eventually caught up to Sega. And then a certain other system that would get announced the following, well, it already had been announced, I believe, but that came out the following year, that kind of changed things as far as ultimately what happened to the Dreamcast and also just the video game industry as a whole. And so we will leave it there on this episode, and to touch base on in hopefully next week's episode. So if you made it to here, I do appreciate you listening. Hopefully this gave you a bit of a nostalgic trip down 1999 in video games, and hope you have an excellent holiday season. Merry Christmas, and we will see you in next week's episode, hopefully. Have a good one.